When the three figures arrived at a location, what seemed like a monkey man pointed forward. From the labyrinth where divine power lay dormant, that space seemed forgotten by all living beings. It was the celestial cave, a place where spirits ascend and become new immortal gods. The three stood outside, commenting that it would normally take a lifetime to find it. Now that gigantic ogre looked down, dragging a chain attached to the one who pointed the way. The young man who revealed the location was being dragged with hostility as the ogre walked. While the fallen human begged for forgiveness, the ogre said he would go in first, so he had to hurry. The ogre looked at the chained man and declared that he would be used as the initial shield. Although many believed the celestial realm to be kind, the place was cruel, treacherous, and merciless. The truth was different. Evil ogres, devious beasts, and constant suffering ruled that divine plane. With a kick, the monkey launched the human forward and said he would disable the traps first. Among the three, the monkey seemed weaker, but he relied on the protection guaranteed by the others. That seemingly fragile human was being used as a temporary hostage by those dangerous figures. Thus he walked ahead, disarming traps and preventing his captors from facing more direct dangers. As they walked, the ogre said the labyrinth contained the sealed powers of the divine emperor. The black-haired swordsman had doubts about what would happen if they were discovered there. While the Hingnim boasted about his own strength, the protagonist simply rolled his eyes in silence. After walking for a bit, the monkey pointed at something, wanting to show it directly to the ogre. Before the four stood the statue of a guardian seated in deep, motionless meditation. The big guy, using his limited intellect, decided to throw the human forward as direct bait. He released the chain and kicked the protagonist ahead, hoping he would face the trial alone. While the three spoke among themselves, the protagonist remained face down on the dirty ground. He got up, wiped his face, but stayed silent, enduring the situation without complaint. The statue before them was gigantic, while the human remained kneeling in a reverent pose. Joining his hands, he began chanting a solemn prayer to activate the guardian. Within moments, the prayer was heard, and the guardian began to react, shrinking in size. Slowly, it seemed to regain awareness through its three mysterious, glowing eyes. Each of the three reacted differently. The monkey was impressed, the ogre indifferent. The swordsman stayed serious, while the human cried silently, moved by the sacred presence. After hearing the prayer, the guardian activated the array and stood before them. With only one eye open, glowing red, it declared itself the blind guardian, divine protector. Barely listening to this, the ogre threw the human forward and charged into combat. Despite the human's protests, the brute started a direct fight against the ancient statue. He activated his power, causing his muscular arm to grow monstrously gigantic. With every strike, he believed he had control, relying on his experience in physical combat. Trying to hit the guardian, he advanced non-stop, while the statue watched with a red gaze. That eye grew more intense, indicating a silent verdict being passed. Since the ogre's response was wrong, he would be punished severely by the sacred gaze. The medallion acted as a target, and the statue launched both hands to crush him directly. The two companions widened their eyes in shock, but the monkey showed more panic than the others. After smashing the brute, the guardian returned to its original pose, hands joined solemnly. The monkey, wearing a horrified expression, didn't know whether to laugh or cry, lost in an emotional breakdown. With his eyes closed, the human warned the monkey to do the same or suffer the same fate. Consumed by rage, the monkey ignored the warning and was immediately marked by the guardian's eyes. Since his answer was also wrong, the statue stepped on him, reducing him to nothing. Now only the swordsman remained, standing still, while the protagonist kept his eyes closed in silence. However, the guardian now closed one eye and opened the other, shifting its posture. With disdain, the swordsman asked the human what happened when the right eye opened. The protagonist calmly replied that the guardian would close the opposite, indicating balance between the forces. But the swordsman gripped the chain tightly, choking the human with brutality. Meanwhile, the statue kept the opposite eye open, watching the growing tension between them. Suddenly, the guardian opened its hands and began to advance slowly toward the two. The statue drew near, while the swordsman lifted the human by the neck with clear suspicion. The guardian then ceased its attack, declaring that their answer had been correctly presented. Even so, the swordsman kept holding the human, who struggled and cursed in desperation. Suspicious, the swordsman wanted to know how someone so weak knew the location of that labyrinth. Staring at the protagonist, he wanted to uncover his true identity and what secrets he was still hiding. As they argued, the guardian opened both eyes, emitting an increasingly intense reddish glow. Trying to pull the chain with both hands, the human asked to postpone the questions. Angrily, he ordered the swordsman to immediately follow his instructions to survive. Meanwhile, the swordsman looked downward, his hand firmly gripping the sword's hilt. He used it to cut the chains that bound the human, freeing him from that humiliating submission. At that exact moment, the guardian activated a seal, transporting them to another part of that immense chamber. The human shouted that the attack would begin, urging the swordsman to follow his directions quickly. Thus, the swordsman grabbed the protagonist by the waist, spinning to dodge the imminent strike. As predicted, the statue approached to launch a frontal blow against the two warriors. Pointing at it, the protagonist declared that the attack would be known as Scarlet Sweep. The two of them now had to prepare properly for an attack coming straight from the front. The swordsman then ran with the human behind the statue, avoiding a direct clash. Right after, the protagonist shouted that now the guardian would immediately attack in the opposite direction. The swordsman reacted, circling the statue and dodging with precision as it searched for targets. Finding none, the statue smiled and returned to its original pose, which meant something important. The protagonist then revealed that this behavior indicated a clear opportunity for an effective counterattack. With that, the swordsman positioned himself, releasing the hidden power of his sword with full focus. After unleashing the power, he ran his fingers along the blade, infusing it with divine energy. Meanwhile, the human pointed at the guardian, ordering not to hesitate when striking. At that moment, he discreetly revealed a trace of his true and mysterious identity. The swordsman raised his hand as high as he could, releasing the power of the divine sword. Then he launched a powerful strike with enough force to slice the sacred statue completely in half. In that world, even a level 99 dog could be treated like a wild beast. If someone knew the right way to handle it, they could turn it into a docile being. Now the protagonist was in trouble, having been captured by that extremely suspicious swordsman. To the swordsman, that protagonist seemed very suspicious and probably knew more than he let on. It seemed he already knew the plans, as he had approached them cautiously from the very beginning. In the swordsman's mind, it made sense that the human had observed everything and then decided to get closer. He had surely stepped on a dry branch on purpose just to be spotted by the three warriors. That's what the swordsman believed, keeping the tip of his sword pressed against his neck. The swordsman demanded answers, asking several questions, conducting an interrogation with full seriousness. While being restrained by the swordsman, the protagonist noticed the sudden appearance of a lotus flower. He quickly closed his eyes, trying to come up with a believable excuse to deceive that swordsman. He knew that the man before him was just a bunch of data, not a real human. He was sure of it because he himself had created that game, knowing every trap and internal system. Everything in that world came from the database, including events, enemies, and hidden keywords. He had created the keywords himself on programming the game and knew exactly which ones to use. With his head lowered, he thought about the ideal words to convince the suspicious swordsman. Soon after, he gave a faint smile, for he remembered exactly what he needed to say. Assuming a serious expression, he looked at the swordsman and promised to reveal the entire truth immediately. The swordsman widened his eyes when he heard that he was the true celestial emperor of that world. It was at that moment that he lowered his guard, just enough time for the protagonist to shove his fingers into his eyes. With that, the swordsman's power was weakened, and the protagonist managed to quickly escape the trap. He had only a few seconds of advantage left, but he intended to make the most of them. The boss of that place was known for its difficulty, as it involved facing the sword spirit with closed eyes. Looking ahead, the protagonist smiled, for he recognized the perfect situation to summon a boss. He only needed to reach the lotus flower, the reward obtained by destroying the previous guardian. He knew the flower could only be stolen by someone who hadn't landed the final blow. A countdown appeared and the flower would vanish soon, so he accelerated without hesitation. However, the swordsman noticed the protagonist's movement and ran after him, eyes red with fury. Meanwhile, the countdown already marked 3 seconds, and he advanced at full speed. His eyes widened as he noticed a shadow above him. It was the swordsman quickly closing in. In the final second, he stretched out his fingers, trying his hardest to reach the lotus flower. As soon as he touched the flower, a red mist appeared and the entire ground began to collapse. By instinct, the swordsman grabbed the protagonist in his arms and managed to dodge that initial collapse. Soon, someone appeared wielding a powerful sword, claiming to be the destroyer of the order imposed by Thor. After being summoned, the spirit of the sword declared that the swordsman would fall to its sharp edge. Carrying the protagonist in his arms, the swordsman shouted, asking what they should do now. He desperately wanted to know the evasion pattern for that hellish battle. The protagonist, still frightened, replied that there was no need to do anything at that moment. The swordsman looked at the enemy, admitting that alone he couldn't stop him with his current abilities. Then he stared at the protagonist, waiting for him to do or say something meaningful. It was at that exact moment that the protagonist decided to reveal the whole truth about his origin. He revealed that possessed individuals had distinct behaviors and began to describe his early experiences. He said that he had gone through the same and that it wasn't a dream, for he had reached level 900. He had become a celestial emperor after realizing he was possessed by the game and had equipped himself. When checking his status window, he saw that he had built up many achievements in that world. Among his feats, he had cleared an entire dungeon completely alone in just 10 seconds. He had also changed clothes more than 1,000 times, performing countless tests with appearance customization. One of his achievements was standing still for 100 hours until a phoenix landed on him. All of this was necessary to reach 99% progress within that universe. Now he was finally standing before the ghost spirit of the sword, his final enemy and true destiny. He was exactly in front of his objective, to be eliminated by the strongest guardian in all of history. Even as he was cut in half, he smiled, for he had completed his final mission within that game. It was shown that at the beginning of the story, there were only two divine entities, two powerful primordial gods. To simplify, it was a prologue explaining the origin of the game from its earliest records. Now the protagonist stepped on a wet surface and knew he was in the exact expected location. Standing outside, he seriously observed the entrance as the level 999 Celestial Emperor. Now he had to face his last obstacle before returning to the real world, the ultimate boss. Placing his hand on the essence of the passage, he knew he had to defeat a monster even stronger. In that game, the ghost emperor named Azura was clearly the final adversary of the ending plot. At that moment, the system asked whether he preferred to give up, restart, or proceed with courage. Furious, the protagonist refused to even consider the absurd possibility of starting over from scratch. Placing both hands on the passage, he showed he was ready to face whatever came next. Wearing an insane expression, he believed this was the right moment to challenge his destiny. As he crossed through, he saw something ahead with a serious expression, staring intensely for a brief moment. Seated on a throne of skulls, someone said they had been eagerly awaiting that inevitable solemn visit. The figure with white hair on the throne smiled gently, revealing himself as the ghost emperor Azura. Before Azura, the protagonist clenched his fists and demanded the enemy's immediate surrender. Leaning forward, Azura said they shared the same blood, as they were divine brothers. Staring seriously, he explained that the protagonist was the god of happiness and needed to understand that concept. Descending slowly from the throne, he asked if his brother would do anything to make someone happy. Facing him, Azura asked if he would receive his blessing as part of the divine legacy. Angrily, the protagonist asked if his brother had destroyed the celestial realm just to seek happiness. Confessing with pleasure, Azura said that destruction and despair gave him insane and unmatched joy. Now face to face with the final boss, the protagonist knew he had to come up with a winning strategy. Golden chains emerged from his body as part of the plan to subdue that terrifying opponent. Azura revealed his true form, with claws and horns, displaying absurd power and demonic presence. Both were now transformed and about to begin a clash between emperors of the same lineage. The system announced the start of a life and death battle, inevitable and final in that world. Quickly, he noticed that his opponent was extremely fast and showed strength beyond all previous foes. Faced with that, he had to apply and practice all the concepts developed throughout his long journey. He knew the fight would not be easy, as Azura was an enemy feared by all existence. Constant flashes resulted from the attacks of both emperors, filling the setting with pure destruction. At a certain point, he found the battle too easy and felt enraged by such an absurd contradiction. Azura, staring at him, asked if his brother's plan was truly to eliminate him without any mercy. With that, the protagonist widened his eyes upon realizing that the second phase was rapidly approaching. An unexpected strike called Memory Incision seemed to catch the protagonist off guard and leave him vulnerable. Delirious, Azura spoke of how pleasurable it would be to brutally eliminate his brother's former subordinates. The activated power caused the Celestial Emperor's subordinates to be resurrected and turn against him. He had already expected this, as he knew the second phase involved fighting his former subordinates. The battle began, and each of them used their unique abilities against their former supreme leader. The first opponent was a swordsman with mastery over summons through the thread of his blade. The second used a technique called Fluorescent Spear, launching simultaneous attacks with the previous one. Knowing the attack order, he prepared to face the next, a hand-to-hand combatant. He needed to act quickly, and launched his chains at the next enemy, trying to immobilize him directly. He knew that once the individual attacks ended, the four would unite their strength for a devastating technique. This final power, called Burial at Sea, would subject him to intense underwater pressure without being able to breathe. Knowing that, he needed to defeat them individually before the activation of this deadly combination of forces. However, he was paralyzed by a new concept that affected his movements absolutely. It was at that moment that the newly invoked concept activated his chains as a source of unprecedented power. Throwing them in all directions, he managed to restrain the four subordinates and asked them a direct question. He questioned who their true master was, for he had already overcome many similar challenges before. Azura realized that her brother's subordinates remained loyal and refused to be manipulated. Now, with his four allies freed, the Celestial Emperor was once again at his full strength. With an excited smile, he thanked the game as he felt his liberation was drawing closer. The system confirmed Azura's subjugation as a complete success, marking the end of the battle. Then, a colorful lotus appeared, representing the restored soul of the defeated Ghost Emperor. The protagonist stood before that lotus and upon touching it, received Azura's soul into himself. He believed he had reached the necessary element to unlock the true ending of that complex story. Now he only needed to run, eat something, and watch the final ending of the main quest. With his hand on the lotus as it faded, he thought this marked his ultimate crossing. However, as it disappeared, the lotus ceased to be tangible to his direct touch. His face took on an expression of sadness, even as he closed his hands in desperate frustration. When he opened them again, he realized they were completely empty, the soul lost in the process. However, he received a message saying that the final challenge had been completed, but not satisfactorily. Now the protagonist stared at that information panel, unable to fully understand its meaning. In another setting, someone in traditional clothes stepped onto the ground and immediately called out to the majesty. The person with braids informed the emperor that an extremely urgent message had arrived. Turning slightly, that person listened intently that the celestial kingdom was under attack. In another scene, someone was shown holding a sword, clearly demonstrating indignation over something serious. Meanwhile, a woman tried to persuade the emperor not to worry about a false alarm. Several different faces appeared, showing people who were, somehow, completely entangled with one another. Everything seemed directly connected to the protagonist, who appeared from behind with 1,000 chains. The swordsman looked at the protagonist in shock, his eyes completely wide in pure surprise. Still staring at that man, the swordsman realized that he was, in fact, the celestial lord. Smiling subtly, the protagonist now believed he had finally understood the whole situation. The map displayed a clear division between the celestial kingdom and the demon realm. It also showed that his 4 subordinates were known as the legendary 4 celestial kings. The broken circle was actually a jade tablet divided into 4 parts. Each piece was given individually to one of the 4 celestial kings of that world. Now the story revolved around reuniting that tablet by traveling through different nations. Only after gathering everything could they defeat the final boss, the true wish of the original creator. The protagonist then clenched his fist, staring at the golden chains, finding it all extremely easy. With a very confident expression, he believed that fighting the best player could even be fun. At that moment, the swordsman placed his clenched fist on the ground, showing absolute respect. He looked directly at the protagonist, deeply grateful for having spared his life earlier. He humbly apologized and, embarrassed, asked if he could clarify a doubt he had. Meanwhile, the protagonist looked down, realizing he had completely forgotten about that swordsman. Turning his back and beginning to run, he said he was busy and intended to ignore him. So he immediately activated his golden chains, launching them in some random direction. That was his power activated, as he was determined to meet the 4 celestial kings. He decided to use his teleport, but at first nothing happened and he remained in the same place. Finding it all strange, he tried again, but the result remained exactly the same. He tried a 3rd time, now putting absolutely all his energy and power into the teleport. After several failed attempts, he was extremely irritated, while the swordsman simply watched the whole situation. So he decided to check his status window to understand why his power wasn't working. The information that appeared on the screen made him immediately very nervous. Through his eyes, an X was clearly shown. All of his powers were temporarily blocked. On the status window, several X marks appeared, indicating that all his abilities were unusable. His face now expressed agony, as he knew he couldn't use even basic skills. Holding the golden chains in his hands, he realized they looked like simple, powerless chains. Looking more closely at the window, he read that he was not yet worthy to use those chains. Now he understood it wasn't a bug, but rather the will of the game's master. The creator was clearly manipulating everything, showing extreme fury over that recent behavior. Realizing this, he felt small, like just a toy in the creator's hand. He gripped those useless chains with such anger that he trembled, hating to fulfill someone else's wishes. In a rage, he tried to punch the status window, furious at being restricted. After realizing it was just a window, incapable of taking damage, he gave it the finger. Because of this provocation, all his clothes and equipment were immediately confiscated. Meanwhile, the swordsman watched in disbelief as the man now stood completely naked before him. A system message informed that the furious celestial lord had confiscated all his gear. The system also warned that removing the final piece would initiate a countdown. Immediately, the protagonist begged desperately, trying to recover his clothes and gear. Fortunately, his strategy worked, and in front of the swordsman, he was once again dressed as the emperor. Seeing that, the swordsman's face lit up quickly, overflowing with joy once more. The protagonist, now with his back turned, talked to himself, reflecting that facing the final boss was hard. He was saddened for being a character created with abilities but unable to use them felt extremely pathetic. A mountainous landscape then appeared, revealing that the map had an absurdly vast extension. Just thinking about it made him pull strange expressions, knowing he was now a slave to the game. He then recalled the exhausting hours, the forced naps, and sleeping over the keyboard. Realizing there was no way out, still with his back turned, he told the swordsman to keep talking. The swordsman formally asked for permission as he finally wanted to introduce himself properly. He said aloud that he was a servant of the celestial king of the East and North. He also served the Jade Dragon Palace, representing its authority and responsibility in that world. Upon hearing this, the protagonist recalled the first time and how utterly shocked he had been by it. He then understood that this man was not some random bandit, but someone truly powerful. Now he looked directly at him, believing him to be a confidant of the celestial king of the East. Because of that, he concluded that he should listen carefully, as that man surely had a request. With his head down, the swordsman said he was going to the celestial realm for a reason. He sincerely believed that someone as special as the protagonist definitely belonged in that place. He begged with all his might to save the realm of the legendary Jade Dragon. The protagonist then reopened his status window, realizing that a quest had appeared. The Celestial Lord and his disciples, the 4 Celestial Kings, maintained order according to their roles. For everything to work properly, there existed a hierarchy, where the Celestial Emperor silently observed and judged. Once a soul was accepted, it was sent to the Celestial Realm, personally guided by the Celestial King Guk. In that place, the soul received peace, abundance, and blessings distributed by the kind Celestial King Mach. However, not even the Celestial Realm enjoyed constant peace, making a judge necessary. The Celestial King sang. Some rebellious souls were sent to the sacred prison, located within the domain of Celestial King Mun Qian, and it was to that place that the silver portal between the 2 worlds now opened. From within the portal emerged the protagonist and the swordsman, newly freed from the previous battle in Azura. Upon exiting, the protagonist observed the pitiful and abandoned state of the sacred cells and corridors. Seeing the swordsman hesitant, he deduced that he preferred to return immediately to his office to avoid trouble. The protagonist knew that, as Celestial Emperor, he could manipulate the entire game according to his absolute will. After analyzing the quest, the system details, and offered rewards, he decided to accept it without hesitation. He wanted to know more about the swordsman, though the man said certain past situations were hard to explain. Suddenly, a grotesque monster with hungry eyes appeared, destroying everything ahead with brutal violence. The protagonist sensed a strange energy, and the swordsman promised to clear the path using spiritual power. Turning around, he saw the giant monster wielding a club and roaring, preparing to strike fiercely. Quickly, the protagonist launched golden chains and neutralized the monster with impressive precision and speed. With that, he prevented the escaping prisoner from striking them before even finishing his swing. Amazed by the quick reaction, the swordsman apologized for not responding before the problem was solved. Those creatures belonged to a small gang that had invaded the prison and established their base there. All the monsters present knew that the swordsman was the rightful warden, responsible for imprisoning them. Even without activated powers, the protagonist wasn't weak, and his chains caused considerable damage to enemies. That's why he launched them at the sea pigs, deformed beings that served as low-level sentinels. Many were thrown aside, as they were only level 120, while the protagonist had already reached level 200. Using the full extent of his attributes, he managed to defeat them all at once with full power. At that moment, the dungeon's curse was activated, triggering reverse mortality on the defeated enemies. With that, all the slain monsters returned furiously to life, now more violent and aggressive. Showing intelligence, the protagonist pointed at the monsters and ordered the swordsman to face them. Without hesitation, the swordsman understood and began an intense sequence of fast and precise strikes. With fiery eyes, he shouted that mere subordinates should never defy the authority of the Celestial Lord. Right after, he asked the protagonist to forget the worms and follow him to the lower level. An old man sitting on the floor remarked that it was the first time seeing both the warden and the emperor. The swordsman replied that the destroyed body was cursed and should be abandoned immediately. Suddenly, the old man took on a grotesque form and began questioning the Celestial Emperor's authority. Before he could finish, he was struck by the swordsman's move, technically called instant death. Afterward, he apologized to the protagonist, who replied that it was common for superiors to suffer recurring curses like that. The protagonist clearly remembered the Yonggang prison, where he had faced similar situations in the past. The longevity of celestial beings was proportional to the divine power held in their spiritual bodies. Because of that, some were immortal, and Dao Munqian developed a unique method to control them directly. He managed the prison alongside 2 loyal subordinates, among them the swordsman with shadow powers. His special ability, Death's Shadow, instantly eliminated targets, surpassing even absolute immortality effects. Even though it was based on luck, the divine protection effect greatly increased the guaranteed success rate. Kicking a door open, the swordsman ordered the Celestial Emperor to follow him without asking more annoying questions. The protagonist then scolded him for acting impulsively, breaking sacred doors without official authorization. As they descended an extensive staircase, the protagonist asked why he had remained wandering for so long. When he heard the swordsman answer ambition, he widened his eyes, surprised by such a heavy word. The swordsman revealed that he had been summoned by the Celestial King and given a mission that required him to leave the prison. The protagonist deduced that this mission involved finding him, rescuing him, or protecting him at some unknown critical moment. Still descending, he reflected that it would be better if the Celestial King truly understood the Emperor's soul. Suddenly, a powerful hostile energy approached, as if someone was attacking them violently by surprise. Sensing the danger, both stepped back at the same time, dodging the strike with absolute precision. On the other side of the staircase, a woman destroyed part of the steps, blocking their path. She wore traditional clothing and a ceremonial hat, with a bold look and uncompromising hostility on her face. With that, she made it clear she wouldn't allow them to pass, blocking the way with silent firmness. Hyuksu was startled when he realized that the chief warden was standing right in front of them. The woman was determined that no one would climb those stairs, completely blocking their passage without mercy. There were two servants of the Northern Celestial King, one of them being the swordsman Riksu. The other servant was Choron, a ruthless woman who dominated prisoners through advanced brainwashing. While Riksu executed and controlled with silent death, she manipulated minds cruelly and without remorse. Now, with several powerful personalities at her side, she seemed determined to destroy any possible resistance. Not understanding, Hyuksu asked if she had forgotten that both of them had exactly the same magical power. But by the way she held her weapon, it was clear she was not on their side. Upon hearing her name, he widened his eyes, shocked, and his mouth dropped open. Standing before them, she gave an evil smile, raised her weapon, and unleashed an extremely destructive, overwhelming power. In the same instant, she ordered her mentally controlled servants to attack Hyuksu and the protagonist immediately. Unlike the swordsman, the protagonist quickly realized that this was no game, but a real enemy. He immediately pulled out his golden chains, ready to defend against that absolutely treacherous, cruel, and cowardly attack. Everything made sense now for Hyuksu. The chief warden had undoubtedly betrayed them. The two were fighting side by side, facing mind-controlled prisoners, surrounded by endless waves of enemies. Riksu, with his expression filled with rage, was preparing to activate his ultimate deadly technique once again. His eyes were consumed with uncontrollable fury, releasing an extremely oppressive and dark aura around him. He channeled all of his energy into his sword, unleashing silent death with unprecedented intensity. His attacks were so insane that the protagonist could only watch, genuinely impressed by the maneuvers. While observing, he launched chains in his direction, shouting for him to grab them and not take any more risks. Riksu stepped onto the golden chains and propelled himself directly at the chief director. Desperate, the protagonist reached out, begging him not to commit such madness now. The swordsman, however, apologized and declared that he couldn't accept such betrayal, not today. That was exactly what the director wanted. She knew he was reckless and extremely impulsive. In an instant, she unleashed a psychic attack so powerful that it completely paralyzed Riksu midair. The magical barrier reflected any impact, and the final blow nearly brought Riksu to death. Fortunately, before the worst could happen, the protagonist's chains wrapped around his foot and pulled quickly. Because of that, his sword shattered against the barrier, but he landed safely on the ground. The protagonist realized that magical shield was called Iron Wall, a powerful celestial force. The woman, with a sly smile, revealed that the real surprise hadn't even started yet. She ordered the guards into position, forming lines as sinister figures began to appear rapidly. She used her brainwashing power to command the guards, turning them into blind pawns of battle. Each guard occupied a specific point, forming a magical configuration known as the Dreadful Celestial Hexagram. That ritual was used in the prison to suppress any inmate who tried to escape, without exception. The protagonist was horrified, for that woman was clearly using powers that belonged to the Celestial King himself. Even more frightened, he thought that a mere warden should never have access to such divine strength. Looking at that woman, he concluded she must have done something terrible to the sovereign. Her twisted smile and crazed gaze only confirmed his darkest and most frightening suspicions. Once more, when he looked at Riksu, he saw that he was consumed by rage. Out of control, he unleashed his full killing intent, and his execution was quick, precise, fatal, and brutal. The protagonist saw only a blur when he realized pieces of the swordsman were scattered completely across the floor. Smiling cruelly, the director commented that although intelligent, that man was always impulsive and reckless. Taking a deep breath, the protagonist wiped his face and asked why she was doing all of this. With a mocking expression, she replied that if she were to explain, they'd have to talk from the very beginning. Looking up, the protagonist noticed the guards were beginning to cast a massive spell. Pointing her weapon, Hurong warned that he now had to quickly choose between two horrible options. If he tried to ascend, he'd die miserably. If he stayed, he'd die beautifully in 30 seconds, starting now. The magic circle was already at 60% when he realized he couldn't escape. He tried to look around, but saw the trap had closed. There were no viable exits. With 70% of the spell complete, he realized that dodging was no longer possible in that desperate situation. With each moment, the director grew more deranged, and the ritual quickly reached 90%. The protagonist, breathing deeply, concluded that the only way out was to do something absolutely unpredictable, insane, and desperate. He lifted his foot forcefully, stomped the ground violently, and shattered the entire surrounding area. His intention was to destroy the field, creating an escape route where the spell wouldn't reach. At the exact moment the spell hit 100%, he vanished in total freefall. Seeing that, the director screamed that he was reckless, for he would fall eternally into that endless void. Even plummeting non-stop, he thought that, honestly, this was the best option in that hellish scenario. Still falling, he reflected that everything had felt off from the beginning. There was something wrong with that prison. He recalled that Yongung was not a prison where mass curse spells were permitted. However, ever since Siuk Qian, the true celestial emperor, had stripped him of his powers, everything had felt strange. In free fall, he wondered if it made any sense to take away his powers and then impose that mission on him. He remembered everything that had happened since he entered, flashing back as if it were a movie. He still hadn't found the boss of that map, who was supposedly hidden in the prison's underground. From up above, the director laughed, hearing him shout that he had already uncovered her entire plan. Hearing that, she clenched her fists so tightly her teeth ground together. In extreme rage, she ripped off her own hat, revealing something hidden that would completely change that desperate situation. On her forehead, a third eye opened. She wanted to verify if he was truly clever. As the woman looked downward, impressed by the protagonist's intelligence, she held her hat firmly. However, she didn't know that a long time had passed, and she seemed to have a rather selective memory. It was about the day Ji Seok Qian had died, collapsing onto his own throne. At that time, 3 of the 4 celestial kings were surprised, but one of them wasn't. That happened because he was atop a cliff, silently speaking with his master. The master in that moment announced his own death, leaving behind a mission that had to be fulfilled. The mission was clear and left no room for error. Protect something at any cost. The master ordered him to guard with his own life a crystal containing 3 eyes. This crystal was to remain hidden underground, isolated, until the final day of the great battle. Now that chief warden placed her hands in a reverent gesture, announcing that she had fulfilled her orders. She clearly seemed to be referring to the sphere with 3 eyes, protected until the right day. Looking toward the staircase, where only traces of the swordsman remained, she said everything had a purpose. Meanwhile, it was shown that the protagonist had already fallen and reached the bottom of that long drop. He was lying on the ground but stood up satisfied, knowing he was in an extremely resilient body. It was explained that in that game, someone at level 10 could never hit a level 1000 being. However, the reverse would result in total and instant destruction of any weaker player, without mercy. That's why it was emphasized that, besides strength, intelligence was also necessary to survive impossible situations. The swordsman had failed at this. He was not able to plan an efficient strategy and died. The protagonist stood up, brushed the dust off his shoulders, took a deep breath, and carefully prepared. But something unexpected happened. A tremendously powerful blow struck him from the side with devastating, surprising force. The impact was so violent it threw even that celestial body far into the distance. Jumping back quickly, he realized he hadn't even had time to rest after that insane fall. Suddenly, he noticed the ground beginning to bubble and understood who the boss would be now. However, looking around, he realized he couldn't see the enemy with the naked eye. He imagined it might be hidden, attacking like an archer, waiting for the exact moment to strike. And just as he thought that, a rain of arrows appeared, coming from all directions. The number of arrows was so absurd that he soon realized it was impossible to dodge them all. Then he quickly remembered how he escaped the previous trap, by breaking the ground with a strike. Repeating the strategy, he stomped hard and ripped out a square piece of the ground around him. Then he grabbed that stone block and used it as an improvised shield against the thousands of arrows. After that, he kept ripping more pieces of the ground, creating a platform where he could stand safely. Looking back, he realized he had finally discovered the perfect strategy to defeat that boss. The protagonist understood that the enemy's power was based on a curse and required sight. He also noticed that the black water spread across the floor was part of the opponent's trap. Each time he touched the water, he suffered a debuff that reduced his speed by 10%. Knowing that, he decided to fight in the air, using his celestial chains as if they were a lasso. He threw the chains at a nearby pillar, pulled himself up forcefully, swinging and avoiding contact with the ground. Steady on the chains, he began swinging, determined to defeat the boss at any cost. Thanks to this strategy, he was able to neutralize the effect of the arrows that kept coming relentlessly his way. However, the amount of arrows was so great that the pillar eventually gave in and collapsed quickly. Fortunately, the protagonist was agile enough to jump and walk across the broken pieces. One of the main features of the celestial chains was the ability to summon them freely whenever he wanted. Thanks to that, even with the pillar destroyed, he managed to stay in the air using his chains. While he followed an aerial trajectory, the arrows continued to chase him, even as he tried to move quickly. So once again, he began spinning the chains like a lasso, dodging the attacks. Using this technique, he managed to shake off most of the arrows despite the increasing difficulty in battle. He went from pillar to pillar, throwing his chains and dodging the countless deadly arrows as best he could. However, the arrows constantly destroyed the pillars, forcing him to find new supports to keep moving. At one point, there were so many arrows on the ground that they almost completely covered the dangerous black waters. Observing the debris, he realized he could use it as barriers, creating an effective defense against the attack. He knew that the greatest weakness of that kind of curse was that the caster needed to see the target. If there was any obstacle in the way, the curse's energy couldn't activate correctly, weakening it. Knocking down the pillars did exactly that, building a kind of protective wall around him. He knew that this strategy was extremely risky, as it could also trap him there like a rat. Looking up, he saw the shadow of someone and wondered which boss was ready now. When he looked up again, he finally saw who the true boss was, and his eyes widened. It was none other than one of the 4 celestial kings, holding his enchanted bow, coldly watching his prey below. Upon seeing the celestial king of the north, a scene instantly played in the protagonist's mind. He remembered the moment when, from behind, that man had declared that his death was near. The protagonist launched himself at him, using his divine chains while staring at that expressionless, familiar face. Now face to face with the former ally, he remembered the promise that he would return alive. Without hesitation, he whipped the king's face with the chains, striking with unexpected force. The impact was so violent that the king fell from his elevated position, surprised by the attack. The water barely touched his protective barrier, revealing the activation of a new magical defense. On the ground, the celestial king seemed to reflect on something, smiling slightly despite visible bruises. Meanwhile, the protagonist continued fleeing from pillar to pillar, dodging cursed arrows. The confirmation came. That was indeed the king of the north, though nothing more than a puppet. It was a copy from the past, a reflection of the king in his days of dark glory. Aware of this, the protagonist charged in, determined to unmask the true hidden enemy. As he approached swiftly, he realized the opponent was casting multiple magical abilities simultaneously. Before striking him, the enemy vanished, reappearing behind him with an almost instant teleport. The king prepared his enchanted bow, wanting to test the protagonist's evasion under pressure. However, familiar with his chains, the celestial emperor spun them, canceling the enemy's abilities. With a smile, the king of the north commented on the vulnerability of magic during casting. The protagonist, also smiling, replied that he would never allow such an opening again. The king tried to increase the distance, but it was already too late for any effective reaction. The protagonist grabbed his garments, determined not to fall into the same trap again. Then he unleashed a series of blows with the chains, striking the enemy repeatedly and furiously. Knowing the second magical weakness, he didn't allow the king to complete any magic arrays. The king tried to raise a wall of iron, but the chains quickly began to shatter it. It was known that by interrupting the array, the next spell would lose a significant portion of its strength. Still, the celestial king hid surprises, frightening the protagonist with a devastating technique. He unleashed the shadow of the black serpent, a lethal strike imbued with a curse. Almost hit, the protagonist narrowly escaped, requiring extreme reflexes to avoid being consumed. He knew that even a scratch from the blade would bring irreversible cursed consequences. Quickly, he launched his chains, trapping the opponent and pulling him with unusual force. Face to face once more, he showed his dissatisfaction to the king of the north with a resolute expression. He decided to extend the combat, throwing himself with his legs around the enemy's neck. He locked tightly, crossing his legs and hurling the chains with absolute precision. Smiling, he believed he had gained a decisive advantage, and that victory was near. With a final blow, he slammed the opponent headfirst into the ground, shaking the entire underground structure. The battle now turned into a contest of pure physical and mental endurance underwater. Both were immersed in the black waters, whose debuff drastically reduced their speed and stamina. However, the protagonist had superior levels, managing to endure the pressure for longer. Even submerged, the celestial emperor's superiority was clear against the king's weakness. He held the chains tightly, gripping the enemy by the legs as he thrashed helplessly. He knew they were nearing the abyss, where the debuff would become even more intense. Both were at their limits, their strength draining away slowly with each passing second. In the end, it was the king of the north who first succumbed to the extreme pressure of the environment. However, before losing consciousness, he smiled insanely and activated his fearsome third eye. The protagonist understood in that instant that something terrible was about to happen there. A voice echoed. He had been approved, and the black waters enveloped him immediately. After being accepted by those waters, a flashback began, showing the waters of the vast sea. Before that vastness stood the true Celestial Emperor and the Celestial King of the North. Damun Cheon wore a deeply concerned expression upon hearing about the foretold death. Even being so close, he didn't like hearing such words, turning his gaze away toward his back. What worried him most was what would happen to Azura when the seal broke. The true Celestial Emperor had a plan, and for that he created a portal and summoned his apprentice. Upon crossing the portal, the King of the North found himself in the depths of the Celestial Temple. It was a place where the Emperor himself had banished magical relics, and he was now handling one of them. When he opened that scroll, the King of the North was completely stunned, eyes widening instantly. He also said that, as the Emperor's confidant, he knew that war had always been doomed to fail, and he never forgot the look Ji Seok Chien gave when he promised to stop that inevitable war. He was the Black Dragon who once cherished the dawn of the Celestial Realm in its former glory. The image on the scroll revealed two smiling brothers, united before chaos struck the kingdom. He didn't know if the painting was real, but he understood the goal of the divine spirit. The heaven of celestial spirits was the most fertile and contested region of the celestial kingdom. The suffering of spirits banished from prisons to infernal regions caused extreme agony and indescribable torment. All that pain was converted into strength, motivating the exiles to reclaim the sacred sky. Jo Seok Chien reinforced his magical chains and prevented the return of sinful souls forever. However, when Azura appeared, the younger sister, everything began to spiral out of control. The Celestial King of the North said he had seen two brothers wandering back when he was still a dragon. Those two siblings were the first to shed blood on the sacred lands of the Celestial Kingdom. Azura weakened her own brother and was the first to set foot in the lands of the North. She gathered evil souls and started a war, attacking the heavens of the spirits with sudden cruelty. The war truly began when Jo Seok Chien imprisoned the souls and created the ghosts. The Shadow of the King said he never understood a future where Azura would join the Lord. They burned the heavens of the divine spirits, turning it into a cursed land full of ghosts. The king regretted seeing his lord ascend without fully understanding the power of the sacred artifact, and he was shocked when the Celestial Emperor himself declared he deserved to die because of it. The Emperor then asked if he understood the true meaning of a deep celestial pact. He received the question in astonishment, momentarily speechless and without visible reaction. The pact was a simple ability, but it became dangerous as the level of the contract increased. It also strengthened the bond, generating special effects similar to a contract of absolute servitude. It was said that the Celestial Lord made pacts with strict transactions and demands among his servants. The Lord lent power, and in return, the servants had to strictly obey 3 celestial taboos. While walking across the stones, the Shadow asked what the first and most important taboo was. The protagonist answered that disobeying direct orders from the Lord was the first and greatest taboo. He also knew that the second taboo was always to offer part of the rewards obtained from missions. The Shadow then challenged him to recall the third celestial taboo that must be eternally observed. That was when he remembered the old message that appeared on the status screen. There, among the categories, the third order stated that the Lord could never be eliminated. This made him recall his past life in a big city filled with technological chaos. He argued with his boss, who was greatly interested in understanding the Lord and Azura better. However, the boss didn't like hearing that Jo Seok Chien was incredibly powerful and decisive. Typing furiously, the boss wanted the game to show the Lord as a voluntary servant of Azura. He wanted to include that the older brother loved his sister so much he accepted the pact willingly. He was a game developer, pressured by a boss mad for immediate results. The protagonist, remembering this, made a horrified expression at that traumatic and uncomfortable memory. Close to the final deadline, he merged the boss's ideas with the original narrative in a tragic way. He then wrote that the Lord, out of love, became the sister's servant, only to be betrayed later. That scenario was added to the Celestial Abyss as a fundamental part of the new divine narrative. Now he needed to hear from the mouth of the Celestial King of the North that the Lord loved his sister. When that scenario was added, his team became worried about the imbalance in the narrative mechanics. He promised to fix the imbalance but ended up dying before correcting anything in the story. The protagonist wanted to fix the story, but died, causing the true realm to suffer because of it. With the 3 taboos active, the Lord couldn't eliminate Azura, being forced to obey her. Her command was clear, to destroy himself and the divine spirits without question. She became the perfect executioner, as the Lord and his servants had to obey blindly. Now the protagonist held his head, eyes wide open, realizing the 4 kings had inherited the taboos. He recalled the words of the Lord: if something was wrong, it had to be torn from the root. Not knowing what to do, He knelt, overtaken by deep and paralyzing confusion. The shadow of the king crossed his arms, watching the protagonist stand still when he should have been moving. He ordered him to follow the blue torches, as he would reveal the 2 orders previously received. The king said he had been summoned to the celestial realm after spending all of his magical energy. In the process, he lost his physical form and ended up sealed within an enchanted pearl. The protagonist kept walking, wanting to know what the second mission order was. The second order was to awaken a new power hidden within him before it was too late. Even though he seemed powerful already, the king believed he should accept the gift without hesitation. The king trusted completely in the Lord's intentions, asking only that he kept moving forward. They walked through a place of dense fog, forgotten for countless eras and almost without traces, until they reached the spot where the shadow hid within the sphere with 3 sinister eyes. The sphere had been in the abyss the entire time, silently observing all events since the beginning. It called the protagonist's soul, asking if he remembered the true mission left behind. Then the sphere explained. It allowed the spirits to escape in order to summon the protagonist. Now, to fulfill his mission, the protagonist had to destroy the King Summoner's own shadow. In the form of a pearl, he asked the protagonist to destroy him completely. It was more than an order, it was almost a plea. Only then would he receive the new power. Without thinking much, the protagonist threw his chains toward the magical pearl and destroyed it. From its core emerged a beautiful golden lotus flower, floating gently in the light. Right after, a system message appeared, stating that the mission had finally been successfully completed. He then remembered the beginning, when the Celestial Lord made that strange and enigmatic request. From the Celestial Lord's initial request, about 10% had already been accomplished with the current progress. The protagonist wanted to know exactly what that Celestial Lord was aiming for with all of this. It was clear that without fulfilling the Lord's full wish, he would never truly be set free. He was supposed to fix the world he had ruined by turning it into a failed game in a past life. As soon as the protagonist touched the golden flower, the swordsman opened his eyes again in another place. The first thing he saw was the prison's chief warden, and he didn't know she was an ally. Confused, he thought she had revived him just to humiliate him again with contempt. The prison warden held a weapon and tapped the swordsman's head lightly in silence. She wanted him to realize that all of this was because of the great master's wishes. While they were still talking, a nearby wall was violently and unexpectedly destroyed by someone. Both looked in that direction and saw a silhouette standing in the middle of the impact smoke. The swordsman could hardly believe that someone had the courage to break through the wall of such a highly protected prison. At first, they thought it was a prisoner, but soon they saw the intruder, a man with long red hair. He wore an eye patch and was known as the Phantom of Flames, a living legend among criminals. On the stairs, the two were stunned to see him there with that mocking smile. The red-haired man looked at them as if mocking them silently, provoking without saying a word. The swordsman, used to not swallowing insults, reached for his sword intending to launch an attack. Then he remembered that his sword had been broken when he attempted that reckless and useless strike. At that moment, he was scolded by the chief warden, who even called him an impulsive innocent to his face. A new explosion hit their rear, revealing that it wasn't just one intruder. The Phantom of Flames scolded his companion, calling him a pig in front of everyone there. The new intruder introduced herself, declaring she was Water, a direct subordinate of the 4 celestial kings. Immediately after, a mountain appeared with a strong golden light. It was the sacred dungeon that had been breached. The celestial kings awaited news and simultaneously began to ponder the invader of great power. They believed that the one who awakened inside the dungeon should be taken to them immediately, without hesitation. Everyone wanted to reach this mysterious person, taking advantage of the weakened barrier of the Jade Dragon Palace. That's when the spirits escaped, and chaos spread across all planes of existence. Another piece of news spread. The Celestial King's power had completely returned to its former master. Upon hearing this, the Ghost King extended his hand, sending his soldiers in a furious wave. The order was clear, to completely destroy the Celestial Lord before it was too late. But at that moment, the Absolute Celestial Emperor activated his pieces and unleashed the new hidden power. The last message from the Northern King was to forget everything about the Celestial Lord's powers. The protagonist was told that a powerful hostile aura would be released as the Great Master's initial wish. The power of utility was a root force capable of greatly enhancing his mystical chains. While absorbing that power, a bonus reward for the 10% of the fulfilled wish was also immediately released. The protagonist couldn't even understand what had just happened inside him at that moment. A black mist touched his shoulder and calmly asked him to focus entirely on what was coming next. When that figure appeared in front of him, he widened his eyes and asked if it was the Sovereign. With a crazed expression, the entity said it would send him to an ideal place to train power. They were already near a portal that the Sovereign had summoned with the intention of training him in secret. As soon as the portal opened, he saw the swordsman and the prison warden together. The protagonist was terrified because he was certain both had died at some point in the past. Faced with that, The Supreme Being pushed him into the portal and ordered him to follow them. The Chief Warden grabbed the protagonist by the arm and entered the portal, while the swordsman begged for help. As they departed, the Celestial King declared that he was one of the four and should be capable. The portal began to close slowly, while his loyal subordinates watched tensely at that decisive moment. The protagonist looked back and realized what was about to happen to everyone there. He pleaded for someone to please show him the true meaning behind all that unexplained waiting. When called Master, the protagonist widened his eyes and didn't know how he was supposed to react. The King of the North only looked sideways with a slight hidden smile on his face. In the end, his portal-shaped gate closed. Meanwhile, in the labyrinth of death, where ancient celestial power had been deeply sealed for ages, whoever conquered the celestial abyss received an immense power capable of challenging the eternal heavens themselves. As soon as the news spread, the earthly celestial king wanted to meet the one who had claimed that power. He then ordered his only servant to fetch him and bring him immediately to the palace. It was said that to save the earthly kingdom, the supreme healing power of the celestial lord was needed. For that reason, a blonde warrior with braided hair crossed dangerous regions to reach the dragon palace. But she was intercepted by a man with red hair, who also desired the sealed celestial power. The fight between them began violently, with the protagonist and the northern servants trapped between them. The clash caused an explosion so intense it destroyed part of the staircase, creating deep cracks in the ground. The impact was so strong that it opened a massive cavity, nearly breaking the prison's entire structure. The flame ghost blamed the other servant for losing track of their targets. Soon a bright light appeared in the distance, and an overwhelming power was launched at the ghost. The blonde woman, irritated, yelled at him to stop talking nonsense and act seriously at once. She believed that if it weren't for his interference, she would have captured the Demon King's followers. The flame ghost didn't want to miss the chance to obtain the Celestial Lord's power. Because of that, he didn't notice a flash grenade had been thrown directly at them. The woman did notice the danger, but by the time she reacted, it was already too late. The explosion blinded them both, hitting their eyes with such intensity that it sealed their powers. With the two incapacitated, the demonic followers appeared and celebrated, ready to deliver them to Empress Azura. The flame ghost was outraged, saying he had been hit only because of the other warrior. The blonde knew she needed to complete her mission and return immediately to her master in the earthly kingdom. However, the effects of the battle were already causing collapse, and the floor began to give way beneath their feet. The evil followers wanted to finish everything quickly, as the environment was about to completely collapse. They noticed the ceiling was also giving in, bringing mortal danger to everyone within that underground complex. The hand of the Celestial King of the North surrounded the entire area, preventing anyone from escaping the destruction. With a single touch, he could crush everything, ending any chance of escape for any creature. Huge stone blocks fell, crushing one of the enemies who was desperately trying to flee through the broken staircase. Within seconds, the entire complex began to collapse with a power known as Sacred Water Burial. 3 days after the collapse of the palace, a dense forest appeared, full of gigantic ancient trees. This place was the Earthly Kingdom, specifically the Great Eastern Forest, where peaceful peoples lived. In that forest, the Divine General had been thrown, and all the village women wanted to care for her immediately. When they found the general unconscious on the ground, they ran in fear to help her with all their strength. After 5 days, she woke up starving and devoured massive portions of stew offered by the kind villagers. Still, they were worried. The general, famous for eating 1,000 bowls, didn't go beyond 800 that time. Even so, she thanked them, recovered, and returned into the forest with full focus on her training. She trained intensely every day and wondered if she was the only one who had escaped alive. She struck the training dummy with fury, molding her muscles and constantly reinforcing her physical resistance. The dummy had a strange smile and wore an eye patch, directly resembling the defeated flame ghost. Enraged, she crushed the dummy as if it were the very enemy who had prevented her from completing her mission. She remembered the prison ruins, venting her frustration as she pushed her physical strength even further. The collapse had been so massive that even the lower levels of the demonic realm were completely devastated. As a result, all demonic servants were annihilated, along with the few prisoners who had still been alive. She believed she was the only survivor and that she had narrowly escaped that cursed prison. She vividly remembered looking back and seeing the flame ghost facing a cruel fate. A giant black hand with monstrous claws approached him as if it would devour him at any moment. The ghost tried to flee but was chased by something chaotic, malevolent, and utterly relentless. Without hesitation, the general struck him with force, launching the rival directly into the unknown enemy. Thus he was sucked into a spiral portal, vanishing before the eyes of the surviving warrior. Now she believed that training was the only way to purify herself and move forward. Even without capturing the conqueror of the celestial abyss, she felt she had learned something during that mission. He questioned a lesser demon if it had seen the so-called conqueror with powers that defy the heavens. It described a man with black hair and clothing, golden eyes, handsome, and a master of martial arts. It remembered hearing he used iron chains, and that ignited her blood with fervor. The general deeply desired to face that mysterious being, for she would no longer accept having failed that mission. She was determined to train him hard so she could surpass him in the future and prove her ultimate strength. Meanwhile, the protagonist was paralyzed, eyes and mouth open, seized by absolute fear. However, at that moment, the protagonist was immersed in extremely heavy and physically demanding training. He was trying to land a strike on the swordsman, while the chief warden offered him practical combat advice. 3 days had already passed since the start of the special training ordered by the Celestial Lord. The swordsman slammed his hands against the ground, frustrated as if he had completely failed his mission. Chorong was also disappointed, feeling she hadn't been patient enough to fulfill her role so far. Despite training for 3 straight days in that extreme terrain created by the Celestial Lord's power, the swordsman looked at the protagonist and quietly wept, while Chorong was losing her patience with everything. The protagonist remembered the weight he felt on his shoulders, imposed by the Celestial King of the North. He could barely recall that everything had started because of his own choices. Watching the 2 trainers in combat, he concluded that he couldn't give up in the face of such a grand challenge. After scolding the swordsman, Chorong stated that their oath remained valid and firm. As they spoke to him, the protagonist watched silently, his golden eyes glowing amid deep thoughts. He reflected that acquiring a new ability wouldn't be a bad thing, especially if he already knew it from before. With a discouraged expression, he thought that, as the enemy's target, not testing new abilities could be disastrous. Chorong then revealed that she could use some of the master's abilities to help him directly with that complex training. She explained that the place was an alternate dimension sustained by the authority of the Celestial King of the North. She said she could only maintain that dimension active for 3 more days before it completely collapsed. Upon hearing that, the protagonist panicked, believing he still needed more time. He said that after that, he wouldn't even have the strength to open another portal, let alone the swordsman. Grabbing her weapon and releasing a magical whip, Chorong demanded they have faith in divine order. She began whipping the swordsman while saying they must honor their lord and survive together. Standing up, the protagonist declared they could count on him, and Chorong pointed to the swordsman as a puppet. He could complete the mission, having gained 2 skill points and needing to make a choice. He could unlock the first level of 2 different authorities or focus both points into one. He thought that unlocking 2 routes would diversify abilities, but focusing on one would intensely strengthen that main authority. After that, he decided he first needed to discover the full attributes of the authorities before making any decision. He chose to unlock the authority called Celestial Net, and also the first root of Chain of Fate. This ability would give him the power of transposition, allowing him to move any object in just 5 seconds. He still didn't know whether it was a moment-based skill or something continuous and adaptable with training. Meanwhile, the swordsman was already ready, calling out to the Celestial Lord as if he were an automaton. He seemed wrapped in control magic, now acting like an obedient puppet. From above, Chorong announced that the training field was under continuous immortality magic. Even if someone died during training, she would revive them, preventing the loss of anyone. The protagonist then thought he didn't need to hold back and should test the squares first. His eyes shone intensely as he launched his golden chains, now shaped in the form of a net. It was called the Celestial Net, while the swordsman waited on the other side, unsure of what to expect from that attack. Not even the protagonist knew if it was an attack, defense, or just an instinctive reaction from the chains. Even so, he decided to attack, and the chains converged, forming a tangle that grew denser and denser. Soon, all those chains merged into a gigantic golden sphere floating with living energy. The swordsman, used as a puppet, was startled by the power being manifested at that moment. The sphere of chains was launched at him all at once with crushing and precise force. Even Chorong was surprised by the power displayed, considering the hidden potential the protagonist had just revealed. The protagonist made a horrifying face, saying he also hadn't expected something so powerful and destructive. When the attack ended, a gigantic hole opened in the ground where the sphere had struck. The chains then reorganized, returning to form the Celestial Net in full obedience to their master. He realized that attack had absurd potential and could decide a battle against any enemy. He thought he had simply let the attack flow naturally, and the chains responded to his thoughts. It was as if the chains of fate read his desires, completely dominating the field with ease. Once again, the chains answered his thoughts and began to form another, even more destructive attack. They grew even larger and slowly began to cover the entire area around the protagonist. This caused in him an even greater astonishment than he had felt during the first manifestation of the power. Using the first authority of hostilities, the celestial network already responded intuitively to his immediate mental commands. He realized that the first unlocked powers were linked to piercing and mastery of complex spiritual barriers. The new abilities seemed to unlock as he deepened his connection with the Chain of Fate. Gripping the chains firmly, he felt he could face not just a single enemy, but an entire army. He remembered that originally the Chains of Fate were balanced weapons, precisely designed with divine authority. But now, this version recreated by the Celestial Lord was even more powerful and responsive to his command. He could feel the presence of the Celestial Lord within his soul, and that made him joyful. On the other side, the swordsman was climbing out of the hole with difficulty, barely able to stand. Even so, he insisted they could still count on him, as he was still conscious and willing. The protagonist was no longer the same as when he began at special training imposed by the Celestial Kingdom. He had been beaten countless times and missed many strikes, but remained determined to surpass his own limits. Back in the present, near the divine tree, stood the earth goddess known as the Sacred Altar. Meanwhile, a long-haired blonde, a faithful servant, respectfully greeted the great queen of the earth. With bright blue eyes and golden earrings, the goddess looked tenderly at her loyal servant. She, after being summoned by her mistress, walked with sadness, for she knew she had failed. Even so, she thought that at least half the mission had been fulfilled by sending the spirit through the portal. Because of that, she gave a wide smile and believed she would surprise, but was surprised by her mistress. As the mistress already knew her failures, she simply knelt, silently showing her deep inadequacy. That was the queen of the Western Earth, and she said the tree had a universal connection. She explained that the branches and roots of that sacred tree extended throughout the entire earthly territory. Branches formed entire kingdoms, and roots supported the vast land created under divine blessing. As she said this, the image of the immense tree appeared, its roots marking that entire vast region. With that, demonstrating her power, she placed her hand on the tree and said she could see everything. She displayed real-time images of events spread across the entire earthly kingdom with precision. The queen explained that this was how they shared the hearts connected to the sacred spiritual tree. She asked the general not to be discouraged, and upon hearing that, the blonde burst into sincere tears. She said that not only had that kingdom missed the great celestial conqueror in battle, she said that the kingdom of growth had lost even more for not teaching its warriors with enough love. However, at a certain moment, she looked to the side, as if absorbing information from afar. She noticed desert root scorpions feeding on the exposed roots above the scorching ground. She saw that those spirits had returned to ravenously devour the roots of the sacred tree. She thought that even the demons from the kingdom of growth had managed to infiltrate once again. She saw armed warriors upon branches and roots, planning to invade the sacred tree amid the chaos. Extending her hands, she saw spirits gnawing at roots, and infiltrators carrying flaming arrows and dressed in black. She knew she could not allow that to continue happening before the divine tree of the kingdom, especially because those spirits thought the roots of that sacred tree were delicious and irresistible. So she tore them from the roots, preventing them from continuing to devour as if there were no consequence. She also removed the invaders from the branches, even those with flaming arrows aimed. The branches grew, piercing through their bodies, causing intense suffering and anguish in the defiling enemies. While that happened, the invaders said she would be punished with eternal combat and curse. Thus, the general noticed something strange in the queen's behavior and asked if they were under attack. However, the queen asked her not to worry, for she had just handled everything. She said the spirit scorpions had become sacred fertilizer for the earth of that magnificent and powerful tree. Just like the remains of those invaders with flaming arrows who had been reduced to useless matter, the damage done to the immense sacred tree was slowly regenerating with the queen's divine power. Thanks to that, the general felt content for managing to sprout just one more new branch. However, the sovereign revealed that she used her divine power to sustain the growing branches, but the speed at which the sprouts were falling surpassed the growth of new resistant branches. This situation was very concerning, as the kingdom sustained by the divine tree could collapse due to the imbalance. Faced with this, the general lowered her head, clenched her fists, and felt deeply frustrated inside. The queen, upon hearing her general promise to try again, felt satisfied with that display of determination. The general was unaware that, at that exact moment, the earthly realms were being protected with great care. She knew her duties and the urgency of restoring the power of the celestial conqueror. She was determined to capture him no matter what, even after hearing there wasn't such urgency. Then the queen began to play her harp, hoping to soothe the general with a sweet melody. She started a cheerful tune, full of lightness, making the general unable to resist the impulse to dance. Soon, all the tree's inhabitants heard the queen's sweet music with emotion. With the melody's soft rhythm, everyone began to dance and temporarily forget their problems. The music of that guardian illuminated souls, restoring peace and balance in the roots of her people. However, she was already exhausted, having consumed a large part of her sacred energies. She thought about the invaders' words regarding a cursed war and wondered about their meaning. But she didn't want to worry her people, so she kept playing while smiling with moving serenity. The harp's sound repelled evil spirits and brought peace and harmony over all the branches. Meanwhile, the protagonist walked, slowly approaching a special place guided by his inevitable fate. He had already reached the root desert of the earthly kingdom and saw the sacred tree in the distance. As he approached, he removed the cloak hiding his identity and contemplated the paradise of life. At that moment, the protagonist received a new mission: to destroy the tree and the entire earthly kingdom now. There were 4 miracles that symbolized the celestial kingdom: the tower of the underworld realm, the volcano of the realm of growth, the mountain of the radiant forest realm, and the tree of the earthly realm. The tree at the center of the celestial kingdom, the divine tree of the earthly kingdom. Chorong warned the celestial lord that they should be careful. From that point on, it was the earthly kingdom's domain. While the two of them were intensely thirsty, the protagonist remained unaffected. That was thanks to the constantly activated passive skill, body of the celestial lord. However, he was benevolent and gave them a portion of the hardworking laborer's sweat. Thus, the two drank and received a status effect that could only be obtained in an extreme state. That problem was already solved. The two were no longer thirsty and were glowing with joy. The swordsman was satisfied to have cooled down a bit in that suffocating heat. Chorong felt that Hyuk-soo should recover his sanity, as he had collapsed for 3 consecutive days. While they spoke, the protagonist observed his new mission that had appeared: training field. As soon as they were thrown from the portal into that arid place with the desert's hot sand, he hit the ground, looked at the mission, and already felt tense just from reading it. That mission to destroy an entire kingdom and cut down the divine tree seemed very confusing to him. He remembered that the Sky Without Limits project was flawed and unfinished, with many settings discarded. He had to be cautious. The current celestial kingdom was different from what he had originally intended. Walking with his hood under that sun, he thought he would begin step by step, climbing the stairs by the steps. He didn't know what hidden intention lay behind that mission given by the celestial sovereign. After a long time walking under that heat throughout the entire journey, the protagonist tried to remain silent. At a certain point, he asked if it would still take long to arrive. They'd been walking for a while and hadn't reached it. He knew that, according to the map, the Jade Dragon Palace was a more isolated place in the Celestial Kingdom. Either way, he had visited a few places in the Celestial Kingdom during his reincarnation. Suddenly, the protagonist widened his eyes and thought he could ask a traveler if one passed by. He asked the girl to observe when that root desert appeared. She prepared to follow the orders she had received and would compare the configurations she already knew. He knew that the soul with magical power talent had received a legacy from the king of the underworld. It was Chorong who carried the seed of the soul inside her, as if she were a puppet in the hands of the northern king. With that, the celestial king was able to recover his divine powers within Chorong's soul. The root desert had been created hundreds of years ago, and what was once a beautiful and calm place was suddenly lost. That had happened 30 years after the fall of the celestial emperor in that same year. However, all that effort was taking a heavy toll on Chorong, who could no longer extract any more information. Concerned for her, the swordsman asked her to calm down and go slowly with the use of her abilities. The protagonist asked her not to worry, as he had already gathered enough information. He asked how long it would take her to restore her divine power, then requested that they move on. With that, the swordsman pointed ahead and asked if they were also seeing it, or if it was just his imagination. There seemed to be a flash of light at the end of the entire desert of roots, but they couldn't be sure what it was. No matter how hard they focused in that direction, neither of them could truly identify what it might be. However, both noticed that there was something, and it was moving. Then all three observed carefully to see what was shifting through the desert sand. When they saw it was a person, the three of them ran as fast as they could. They treated the man, removing the debuff caused by thirst. Of course, they did this against his will. They applied medicine to his wound, and despite the burning pain, they managed to restore his health. Now they were dragging the poor fellow through that scorching desert. That's when the protagonist noticed he was from the Kingdom of Growth and decided to lay him down. The swordsman was already preparing to care for him, but was promptly scolded by Chorong. Sitting against a rock, the man asked why they had saved his life. The protagonist said they were travelers with business in the earthly kingdom and found the desert too vast. When the man heard they needed someone to explain what was going on, he remained silent. First, the man surprised the three of them by asking if they were on the side of the earthly kingdom. He said that the two kingdoms were at war and asked them to support the Kingdom of Growth, and he would explain everything. The map showed that the heavens had split, and after that, each followed its own path. Just like the Underworld Kingdom, a broken sky, dysfunctional without its own king. The Radiant Forest Kingdom was eternally sealed behind an infinite barrier, cutting off all communication. The earthly kingdom was still fighting the demon kingdom as the center of the celestial realm. Lastly, there was the only heaven that abandoned its status and allied with the demon kingdom. Thus, the forces of the demon kingdom were attacking the other heavens indiscriminately. Whenever he heard of betrayal, the swordsman would lose control. That man said the radiant forest kingdom was sealed, and the kingdom of earth was now full of traitors. The protagonist, while looking at the man, said he understood his point of view but had one question. He wanted to know why the earthly kingdom was considered a traitor. The protagonist said that, as far as they knew, only the kingdom of growth was on the side of evil. With that, the man gave a crooked smile. Then, placing his hand on his stomach, he laughed maniacally. He said between laughs that it was fitting for cowards hiding in the depths of the sea to know nothing. They were all horrified by the expression and the harsh words the man was saying. That man said that if they had a shred of sense, they would help the kingdom of growth burn the earthly kingdom to the ground. With that, the protagonist understood why that final mission was tied to such a chaotic scenario. He'd had that idea when he was in a rush and decided to betray one of the celestial kingdoms. He even chose clothes very similar to those of the man from the growth kingdom watching from a distance. He made it so that Zhongjang would blame himself along with the kings for the fall of the emperor. In the end, he became curious and began to believe that loyalty meant erasing the wine kingdom. That's why the man was saying so many things completely out of sync with the story. Thus, the man said that only they were loyal to the true rulers of heaven and earth. For that reason, he said that if they were conscious, they should join his sovereign immediately. He also wanted to burn Jiguk and erase all the corruption sprouting from the roots of the false kingdom. Slowly rising from the ground, the protagonist said they now more or less shared the same goal. The man leaning against the rock didn't believe they had really agreed to ally with one another. Because of that, the man began to ask other necessary questions to confirm the protagonist's intent. He said he looked toward a distant future where they would defeat Azura and take over the demon kingdom. He thought that person couldn't say those things so blindly like a child. However, the protagonist stated that he could, because he was Jae Seok-chien, the conqueror of the cavern. Seeing this, the man was surprised at first, but still cracked a wide smile. Smiling, he said he had already met countless people who claimed exactly the same thing before. The protagonist stared at him, extended his hand, and showed something important he was holding. With the object in hand, he didn't know if it would be recognized, but he decided to show it anyway. That celestial plaque proved the identity of the kings. It had been found in a chest during training. At that moment, he knew it had been left intentionally by the northern king, Mun-chien. The protagonist thought that if that plaque still existed, Zhongjang's soldier would recognize it. The man bowed his head completely and asked if it was true or just an illusion. The protagonist said he should accept the truth and leave the rest of the matters to him. He said he would burn Jiguk in the name of that soldier, but wanted one thing in return. The protagonist closed his hand, placed it on his chest, and said the message was simple. The message was that he would return soon, and that would be enough for now. Even his nearby subordinates paid attention to that message spoken with such conviction. After listening carefully, the soldier bowed to the Lord, with tears streaming in emotion. He recognized that man as his lord, overwhelmed by a feeling of deep and lasting loyalty. A few days later, in the kingdom of Jiguk, the guards were conducting regular patrols at the root gates. During the rounds, they noticed the approach of an unusual cart that sparked collective curiosity. From atop the wall, they observed closely what was happening outside with heightened attention. One of the patrols informed the general that new refugees were arriving and asking for immediate shelter. As soon as she heard this, that woman slowly rose from her seat. Now standing completely, she felt it was time to welcome the kingdom's new flowers. She was a woman with violet hair, acclaimed guardian of the root gates. All who arrived seeking shelter were received by her with sweetness and kindness. Because of that, commotion quickly formed around her, with everyone wanting to be personally welcomed. The three arrived and watched the commotion, finding the number of refugees strangely small. The protagonist recalled what the soldier had said. The tree drained the life around it. He had also said that Jiguk avoided giving answers, even when citizens asked direct questions. They kept pretending everything was normal, and that soldier hated such widespread hypocrisy. In the middle of the desert, the three decided to disguise themselves to investigate what was happening. It was an experiment only the protagonist could carry out, but he wouldn't use the full power of the net just yet. So they decided to infiltrate as ordinary civilians and observe everything discreetly for a while. The problem arose when the swordsman noticed something strange. Only women seemed to enter easily. There were two distinct paths, one for women and one for men, like a form of segregation. They both needed to investigate, but there was concern about being separated or excluded by the internal rule. The protagonist said it was fine, since they would be operating separately anyway. He explained that the sacred tree had 3 main areas, requiring each person to be isolated. The swordsman was startled when the girl said the lord would not be entering with him, but Toddy would be the only one going underground, while his lord would proceed to the palace. The violet-haired woman, upon receiving the message, smiled cheerfully and prepared for the reception. While the swordsman was taken underground, he watched the other 2 heading through the main gate. Irritated, he said he was part of the Lord's group and also came from the Northern Sea. Even unwillingly, Hyuk-soo was dragged into the underground, where his mission would unfold. Charon, on the other hand, was taken to the great forest where most of the citizens lived. Meanwhile, the protagonist followed the guards escorting him to the supposed royal palace. They planned to reunite at the tree's Sap Plaza, located in the kingdom's civil area. All realms had free access to that region, which was usually very busy every day. However, the protagonist realized that the place he was in didn't resemble a palace at all. Frightened, he looked around and felt he was about to be attacked by someone. Behind him, the blonde general with long hair had her weapon pointed at the back of his neck. She wanted to know if he really was the conqueror of the Celestial Gate, as he had claimed before.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye-bye.
In front of a dark entrance, Charon wondered if that was the gateway to the kingdom of Jiguk. At that moment, someone placed a hand on her shoulder. Looking, she saw it was the guardian and general, a woman with striking features. Closing her eyes, she remembered she had promised her lord not to stand out. Now she figured she should speak to that woman calmly and act naturally. Looking at the guardian, she wanted to know why only she had taken a different path. She was surprised when the guardian hugged her tightly. The guardian said that was a good question and noted her skin was cold and pale. She also had a faint scent of seawater, which made her think she was a refugee from the kingdom of Daemon. She wasn't sure if she was truly a refugee. After all, the only inhabitants of that massive prison were inmates and directors. Thinking quickly, she said she was a refugee since the prison had been destroyed. According to her, the kingdom of Daemon, like Jiguk, fulfilled its duties to the divine kingdom. The guardian said she enjoyed seeing the despair of that flower, but rules were rules. Now the question was whether being a prison guard qualified her as a refugee or not. Charon heard from that guardian that she would need to prove she really was a refugee. Snapping her fingers, the woman said she would have to prove with her life whether she was truly willing to continue. She would test her sincerity the most fitting way for a beautiful flower, and several guards appeared. That's how she realized she wouldn't be tested verbally. It would all end in an arm wrestling match where she'd need to use all her technique. Meanwhile, the guardian kept provoking her. But Charon knew that, despite asking for proof, the guardian was just toying with her. So she asked the guardian if, in case she lost, she would truly be expelled. As an incentive, if she won, the guardian would provide information about anything she wanted. After saying that, she asked if that wasn't exciting enough for her to fight like a true flower. Standing before the memory door of her master, she needed a word that would trigger it. She desperately needed the information that General Guardian held, so she managed to focus. Activating her third eye, she said she would gladly accept the offer. In another place, the protagonist dodged the precise strike the blonde had prepared for him. After seeing him dodge, she thought he was really fast. Now she was on guard and would strike with much more power, so she held her weapon tightly. Already with the staff position, she unleashed a force as strong as she could muster. That was like her ultimate power. She even asked what he thought of such strength. Now she thought there was no way he could dodge that attack and wanted to see him try. To her surprise, he didn't even move a muscle. She thought it strange that he didn't even try to dodge. She shouted that if he didn't dodge, he would regret it. Then she released the power, and it was so thunderous it could be felt miles away. In a peaceful place where everyone walked calmly, the branch of the tree where many were sitting even shook. The force she used was so great it broke the training dummy she had for a long time. The young blonde was still in the same position she had started the attack in, still holding her spear. She looked to the side and saw the destruction was massive. She was exhausted from using such a large amount of power, and when she saw a silhouette through the mist and dust, she thought it couldn't possibly be her rival. The one she had challenged was still in the same spot and hadn't moved. Everything around had been destroyed, but he seemed completely unharmed. Looking at her, with a few scratches on his face, he thought that had hurt a lot. Now he knew that blonde was no longer the same from the original game story. According to the story, she had been ordered to find the Celestial Gate, but her fear of death stopped her. He noticed her power was far greater than before. Someone at level 35 had gained 100 more levels, and now she bowed her head before that man, for she had failed once again. She apologized, saying that as her master's servant, she couldn't lead him untested. But after everything, she admitted he was the conqueror of the Celestial Gate, the hero who would save the kingdom. Taking the lead, she told him to follow and said she'd explain everything along the way. Even after he called her, she didn't stop, so he had no choice but to follow her. He started running after her as fast as she pushed forward, heading toward her master. Meanwhile, her master was leaning against the tree, listening to everything that was happening, as she always did. When he noticed what she was doing, he simply fell silent, staring at that figure. Meanwhile, that master said it was strange, but that she should eliminate him. That master thought the tree was saying increasingly insane things, and those episodes were frequent. Now she was connected to the sacred tree as one. Her divine power was slowing the decay as much as possible. It also let them share thoughts, emotions, and even visions, and that was why she had heard. The tree's voice, through all the distracting noises, seemed not to want to carry out such a complex act. Meanwhile, she heard her servant report that someone wished to speak with her. In truth, the sacred tree was a devourer of souls. From that, its roots and branches grew, and then it produced fruits with mysterious powers. During the reign of the Heavenly Emperor, some evil souls managed to escape judgment through tricks. But when Jiguk found those souls, she threw them to the sacred tree to feed. In this way, the tree eliminated evil souls and turned them into fruit. Now, however, the protagonist was face to face with a demonic tree. He, unlike other people, could see what that tree had truly become. In front of him stood the master of that place, who said that he had finally arrived. She called him only Conqueror, saying she had been waiting for him for a long time. Looking at him, she apologized for not having gone to look for him. He did not know exactly what was going on and told her that he had heard the tree was rotting. Looking at her servant, she said that, given how the conversation was going, the servant must have talked about her intimacies with the Conqueror. At that, the protagonist raised his hand and said he had a question. With her permission, he said that he had heard she needed his help. He did not know what made her think he would be willing to help her. She said that the skills of the ruler of the heavens were capable of exerting such power. Looking at that person, it was just as he had imagined from the start. She did not recognize him. He had the same appearance the immortal emperor had had in life. The only thing she said was that she had already checked whether he was or was not a divinity. She said that if she shared with the tree, she could sense his energy clearly. For she said that if he were on the side of the demon realm, he would not have that ability. Hearing all this, he decided to ask another question. He wanted to know why the tree was like that. He knew the tree could swallow the souls of an entire nation without trouble, yet now it was rotting. That woman agreed with him and said the tree was having digestive problems. Because that realm was vast, they had sent guardians to every region, and even so it was not enough. She said the demon realm grew stronger by the day, and they also had a new enemy. Then he asked if it was the realm of Zhongjang, and she confirmed it. She said they knew the geography well, perhaps through espionage, and were more troublesome. He thought she was doing again the same thing she had done before. Now she did not recognize him, but she was also completely indifferent when she spoke of her old friend. Jiguk and Jae Seok-cheon were like family, so there was no way she could have forgotten his face. Even so, he had really gotten goosebumps when he saw Damon's true form the other day. Now he felt nothing toward Jiguk. It was like a strange experience he was going through. He imagined it might be related to the curse and should check to be sure. Meanwhile, on another branch of that great tree, Chorong was still locked in that endless arm wrestling streak. She already had 12 consecutive victories, beating all those guards who opposed her. She thought the will to survive had made her stronger. Now she looked at that guardian and pointed at her, saying the guardian would be the final round. She dared to call her out for a final arm wrestling match to prove who was strongest. Of course, that guardian accepted the challenge. She wanted to know what trick Chorong had pulled. And when the guardian asked that, Chorong figured she had found out that she had mixed hypnosis with the powers of King Damon. She did that to beat her opponents. But she thought that knowing the trick was one thing, facing her would be another. Now they would test their strength. Something caught Chorong's attention terribly. Whispers were coming from the guardian. She was murmuring that she would not need to use her tricks in that arm wrestling match. Back at the trunk of the tree, that queen said that countless souls were trapped in it and were not fully digested. They were all seeking revenge, and all of them wanted to be stronger when they left that place. Counting on her fingers, she said what she saw was the evidence of that battle, and that once only the strongest soul remained, it would fall. The emperor noticed she was using that for her own war, and she didn't deny it. She said she called that soldier who was devouring the others a zombie soldier, for by absorbing the energy of countless souls, the soldier gained a highly destructive ability. She said that when a soldier was born, she would take him out of her kingdom like a kite just playing her song, because the tree was not so dynamic, but it could reach the kingdom of Zhongjang. Meanwhile, in the arm wrestling match with an impressive victory, the short-haired, black-haired girl couldn't believe it. She had just defeated a guardian and didn't even seem to have used that much strength to do so. Even though she lost, all the guards were thrilled, cheering, saying she was now a new refugee. Looking at Chorong, she said she would tell her anything she asked. She said that, as a flower, she should know what she was saying. However, that guardian seemed strange. The queen of that place said too much blood had been spilled there and they should now prevent that from happening again. They had attacked the neighboring kingdom, saying that thanks to the zombie soldiers, the other kingdom had weakened. The truth was that the three of them were gathering information, so she should ask directly. The protagonist was also ready to ask questions. This was the goal with that queen. However, what he found was something terrifying that he simply couldn't believe with his own eyes. Standing before it, his fists clenched. He didn't know what it was, but he was going to find out. It looked like several volcanoes had just erupted, and he stood there watching. No matter how he looked at it, the result was the same. He knew that, according to legends, there were celestial caves in various places. However, the only cave they had known had disappeared after the protagonist conquered it. So it didn't matter how he looked, this one could be a paradigm cave, and so he was confused by facts like the existence of such a place right under everyone's eyes. The strangest thing was that it seemed no one else cared about it. It was hard to believe no one else knew about that celestial cave, and when the swordsman decided to ask someone if they could also see it, he was surprised by the answer. He realized only he could see the cave. Still speechless, he noticed a tremor occurred. Meanwhile, Chirong was exercising her right to question the guardian. She wanted information about the war with the four kingdoms and about the possible death of the ruler. She was interested in the positioning of the celestial kings. Chirong had sought that information the moment she connected with the king, and through his memories she knew they still had the power to fight the demon kingdom. In the memories of the king of the north, she saw that the four celestial kings had fought several times. Through the results of those battles, a hierarchy had been established. She asked the guardian if that kingdom didn't have such restrictions among its people. The guardian understood and told the girl she had something to show her. But just as she said that, a stronger tremor occurred, and now that tremor seemed to be breaking through barriers. The swordsman saw that part of the tree was cracking. A message was sent to everyone. A special ability had been activated. One of the guardians had activated the extension of extreme limbs. The golden-haired guardian had grown to a disproportionate size. All the women living in the Great Tree Kingdom began to panic. In a rush, the swordsman searched for his partner, who was startled to see him dressed like the other women of the kingdom. He asked her to remember the Lord's words before they entered that kingdom. The protagonist had warned them he needed to conduct an experiment, one that only he could perform. Knowing the time had come, she proposed prioritizing the civilians, and as they were preparing for that, they heard the Lord's voice apologizing to them. He was inside the tree and didn't have time to explain. He said the general was going into berserk mode. That's why he asked Chirong to hypnotize all the civilians. Even though he said he was fine, he was injured and hadn't noticed the system was active. He was referring to willpower, the attribute capable of overcoming all status effects. It would be like the time she had hypnotized Hyuk-soo. Of course, the result would vary depending on each one's willpower. It hadn't been long since the golden-haired guardian's willpower had been nearly depleted. She stopped and thought that she was one of the strongest guardians, and her physical power was at its maximum. She wondered why her attack hadn't worked against the Lord. The protagonist knew that the effect of anxiety could wear down one's willpower. He hadn't paid attention to it because he had gotten rid of that system during the game's development. He thought he already had Momengsho under control and decided to test his power over Jiguk. He asked her to obey her master's command, and even though he looked exactly like Lord Jae-seok-chien, it was a shock to him to realize that she hadn't recognized him, just like the King of the North. And that was a problem for him. He trusted that she would be under his command. Instead, he was caught off guard. She attacked him mercilessly, and the two of them ended up inside the tree. By the time the protagonist realized it, it was too late. There was no time to react. The question was, who knew the bond between the Lord and his subject had been severed? While he hadn't realized the oath had been broken, the Guardian was already showing signs of instability, and that mistake only made Momengsho even more anxious. And the more her anxiety grew, the more her willpower dropped, until it hit zero. This caused her to enter berserk mode, and the great tree began to be struck by the constant blows caused by the Guardian's instability. While the protagonist was inside the tree, injured, she was completely out of control. To make things worse, Jiguk had fully fused with the great sacred tree. The positive side was that Jae-seok-chien was immune to the tree's ability, and that situation brought him fragments of memories. While the game was being released, many questions were raised in the form of criticism, including putting the blame for the game's failure on the protagonist who needed to leave the past behind. At the moment, he needed a quick strategy and discovered the Guardian's pattern. He knew she was going to attack with that massive weapon again. She was about to unleash the same sweeping attack. He wasn't sure if her range had always been that big or if it was due to her current state. Quickly scanning her current reach, he was alarmed. He could barely believe it would reach the great forest and the entire desert of roots. If she managed a perfect strike, everyone would be devastated. He thought of a way to stop the massive attack. The Lord knew his two allies couldn't stop the Guardian at the level she was in. It was certain there wasn't enough time to evacuate the civilians. As he thought it was too late to use his omnipotence, he heard the flapping of wings. Through the tree he could see that the other guardian was also activating her special ability. That guardian was allying with the Lord and placing her power at his service. Faced with that proposal, he realized that his allies were like powerful, flexible wings. Unfolding her wings and releasing a color, she said she had enough power to buy time. Just as the golden-haired guardian began her attack, she immediately activated the attack redirection technique. Being smaller and lighter, she had mastered it. To the Lord's surprise, she said she could block a berserk attack only once. She would need at least 30 seconds to recover and would be vulnerable. Following the Lord's orders, the swordsman offered to catch the guardian in midair. As the swordsman placed the guardian on the ground, the Lord thought he would need an appropriate tactic. Immediately, both allies stood ready to carry out the Lord's commands. That's why he needed to think carefully. He had a DPS with instant destruction capability and a low success rate. But thanks to the tank, they actually seemed to have a chance. Even so, he couldn't make rash decisions. He entered a meditative stance and tried to think clearly. Meditation temporarily increased his willpower. With that, he bought himself some time and a problem to solve. To be honest, it had been a while since he felt that kind of adrenaline. It had been a long time since he remembered that user experience could be beautiful. Even without explaining anything, it was possible to lead users to learn. It was so good that those in a meeting with him would feel like they owned the universe. But back then, he was just a grumpy game developer. The rules were clear. Whenever users came across something similar to what they had learned before, they could make their own judgments and learn on their own. Sitting inside the tree, still meditating, he remembered old memories. When he was just a boy in an arcade, listening to his friends talk about how fun the game was. The shiver he felt in his body back then, and the sensation. The same one that made him decide to one day become a game developer. And now he felt more than simple appreciation. He was in complete ecstasy. He didn't know how he could have completely forgotten the sensation he had felt as a child. Always telling himself how busy he was, giving excuses about how the world had changed. Now he noticed that the woman had changed positions and remembered when he fought with the Buddha. After meditating, he asked his allies to go to the location he would indicate. He informed everyone that the Guardian would launch a frontal attack. The plan was to redirect the attack toward the ocean and minimize the damage, while the colossal-sized Guardian prepared for another strike. She positioned herself, her eyes completely deranged. Everyone could already feel the impact of the attack the moment the staff touched the ground. At the same time, the lilac-haired Guardian announced that her recovery was complete. The Lord's plan was to deal with her in a special way. The protagonist had a trick. He knew that if he could stop the monster's attack 3 times, the hammer would become fragile enough to fall apart. To fulfill the Lord's orders, the Guardian took her position. And just as the protagonist expected, the weapon's handle ended up snapping. That event caused instability in the Great Guardian, who was preparing for a new attack. Even without attacking directly, the sphere of her weapon ended up falling, and it started to gain speed. That way, it now resembled an unstoppable steamroller. Although it seemed unpredictable, the Lord would calculate the movement the sphere would make. Within moments, he had already mapped out the trajectory, and he was right. Because of that, they should be able to anticipate it. With yet another feat, the swordsman also gained experience, and he managed to notice at the right moment what was happening. Still in a meditative pose, the Lord could understand. He was not just the developer behind the War of the Heavens. While thinking this, the swordsman was learning how to balance things properly. He was still adjusting to the correct movement to change the sphere's trajectory. While everything unfolded, the protagonist had his eyes wide open. He wasn't just the developer, he was also its first player. He began to remember back then, when he was asked why he would take over the team. He had achieved success with a game franchise, but requested a transfer. He thought it would be fun to take on what his colleague called a low-performing team. The team had gone through 3 managers over 6 years, and that hindered development. Even so, he met with the CEO and asked to lead the team. He still remembered the first time he saw them. Arriving, excited, he asked for everything to be discarded because he would now manage the team. Excited, he said he had several ideas and could make the game closer to real life. He was going to create a story related to heaven, as he compared life to hell itself. Even putting his career at risk, he would work on the War of the Heavens. He had faith. He believed it was up to him to keep the team united. His proposal was to bring together all the ideas they had always wanted to realize. Team morale was high. There were risks, talks about dreams, and debates. After the fun stage of development passed, the result was not good. Unfortunately, he wasn't approved, and the CEO asked him to redo it, giving him a deadline of 2 months. If he didn't deliver, the team would be dissolved. He heard that if that happened, he would return to his previous department. His teammates wouldn't be as lucky. The look in the boss's eyes said he wanted the protagonist back in the former department. Of course, all that made the young developer very angry. The worst part was facing his team, and now he had to create an RPG as the executives wanted. He warned them that they were in a time of crisis. The priority was to elevate the team's experience, even if they were low performers. All of them showed the will to achieve, making the protagonist believe it was possible. But the news he received deeply shook his core. He was told that someone from his team had grown tired of life. At that moment, just like before, he didn't know when it had all begun. The destruction continued, and Churong tried to use her powers as much as she could. Alongside the swordsman, they tried to hold back the Great Guardian, but it was certain that when hope ends, fear takes over. The protagonist, for a time, even tried to pretend he was okay. He pretended as much as he could that he didn't care. He managed to act as if he had no regrets. It was as if he had forgotten everything when he gave in to that fear. He ended up giving up on everything, but now he was willing to help in any way he could. And he had to make a decision, for the Great Guardian was falling in their direction. Standing on the only spot he could inside the tree, he was ready to cooperate. And by doing that, the shock following the special ability was reversed, and the Great Guardian had fainted. She wouldn't be able to move for the next 12 hours. Meanwhile, she rested in the palms of Churong's hands. The guards, needing to speak with the duo, didn't know how to address them. The swordsman asked that they be called the Vanguard, as vassals of the Conqueror. That guard simply listened as someone mentioned that the underwater prison would be rebuilt. When Churong looked back, she saw a strange figure and told everyone to stay on alert. It was normal for the Demon Guild to try to invade, but there was more than just demons there. The root scorpions had also arrived, and in large numbers. The protagonist knew that in 30 seconds the undead from the tree would awaken. He was being notified that their resentment still lingered in the air. An intense battle was about to begin. With General Moncho in a smaller state, they were short on defense. Everyone would need to give their all to stop the scorpion invasion. Hyuk-soo unleashed his instant destruction, an attack that covered a vast area, but he was warned that the danger was above him. He turned to look and saw something shining like a bomb of light. Everyone looked and saw the wall plated with iron. The Guardian was also helping in that small battle, and everything was heading toward disaster. Inside the tree, a fight was also taking place. The Lord was battling the undead. It was when he was ready to end it all and forget. But in the heat of the battle, he changed his mind. Now he didn't want to leave anything behind. Mancho was trapped in delusions and memories of the time she received a mission to carry out in a pair and ended up returning alone. She even tried to explain that she hadn't completed the task as instructed. They had orders to return quickly, and she didn't want to disobey, so she came back early. The young woman who accompanied Mancho said there was no problem. She would enter the demon cave alone. If she encountered a problem too big, she would return. Relieved, Mancho thanked her companion for letting her stay on guard outside. She said that even if she went in, she would only be a burden since she was weak and couldn't help. And now she stood before the queen of that realm, having to explain herself, and heard from her sovereign that she never expected anything more from that flower. Right then, the general woke up startled. As soon as she woke up, she had a strange feeling of freedom. Beside her were her friends, happy to finally see her awake. They had been worried since she didn't even wake up after smelling the food. But the young girl grabbed the skewer that was bigger than her and ran off. She had to find her queen. When the queen attacked the conqueror, something intensified inside her. In just a few moments, she could no longer control her own abilities. After hearing a loud bang inside her head, she began to see the face of her friend, the one who had let Moncho stay on guard outside the demon cave. Now that girl was running. Looking straight at that huge monster, she asked if it was the same girl from before. However, that demon was wholly an explosive light bomb using only its teeth. At that moment, the swordsman appeared and drove his sword through that monster. He warned the general that her body was too weak to join the battle. Meanwhile, the guards were trying to hold out as best as they could against those demons. The shrunken general, as soon as she saw the swordsman, recognized that he was the prison warden. But he couldn't hear the girl because of her small size, and he needed to tell her something to do. First, he said that the demons were using the root scorpions, and she became worried that she had attracted the demons. He said that in part it was her fault, but she shouldn't worry for now. She said she understood everything that was happening, so she would be fine. It was strange because after the intense battle, the Demon Guild went silent. But Churong thought they were probably regrouping, so they should take the opportunity to counterattack. Besides that, there was another problem. The queen of that realm had fused with the tree. The guardian ordered that all the fruits of the sacred tree be brought to that location. While eating, Churong said she felt sorry for having to consume so many precious fruits, but the guardian said they would all be gone in the next battle anyway, and they should prioritize someone who could raise a defensive barrier. Of course, the iron-plated wall could destroy anything it considered an enemy. She knew it was the only way to prepare the energy bombs the guild was using. Everyone knew that divine powers and abilities had levels, and for her to use the power of the King of the North, she would really need to consume all the fruits to temporarily increase her divine power. He would need 108 fruits to use the ability a single time. The swordsman, laying the general down, said he would return to the front line. The general already had her position, she would fight alongside Churong. She had heard that the general had a task for her. It was true, but first, the general would have to answer a question. She asked if her memories had already returned, because before the Lord disappeared, he had told her something. He had ordered her to discover the true ability of Jiguk. It seemed that the kingdom's citizens might know something, since even the sovereign had lost her memories, and that would make it harder to uncover the kingdom's true ability. There was one person who was free from that spell, General Molmangcho. The logic was that after fighting to the extreme, she should have reset her memory. Upon hearing those words, the general remembered things she had heard from an old friend who used to say that everyone had roles to play and that diversity made everything more beautiful. Now the general knew that what she had felt before wasn't a sense of freedom. It was the feeling of recovering something she had lost and missed. Now she admitted that the ruler of the heavens was right. She had just remembered how to end that battle. Meanwhile, the fight continued between the Lord and the undead soldiers. With his golden chains, he was gaining the upper hand over the others. Even outnumbered, his strength and power were greater. He had a certain skill in handling the chains, even when fighting against several skilled undead, including some archers. But nothing went unnoticed by the Lord's eyes. The protagonist, with his chains, pulled out the sword embedded in one of the undead, to use it as protection against the rain of arrows flying toward him. He thought it was a good time to remember that this body was made for combat, and that's why he would dedicate himself solely to that purpose. Even if 3 of them attacked at once, he was already planning how to handle them. He knew he could leave it to the body. It would automatically fight the enemies. Even with involuntary movements, that battle would drag on for a long time. Simple movements wouldn't be enough to solve it. He knew the sacred tree served as a great goo poison chamber. When all the undead soldiers were eliminated, the tree would spit out the living soldier. That's why he needed to destroy a considerable number of soldiers at once. That's why he needed to sense the soul of his absolute subject trapped inside the sacred tree. But he wasn't talking about the sovereign he had seen earlier, but the true one. General Yenbu was informed that all troops were on standby. There was no more time to waste. They were all gathered, including the last line of defense. She believed that was it, but in fact, there was more. General Moncho had requested their presence. She would speak to all the citizens through Churong's power, to ask everyone about their memories of the undead soldiers. A silence lingered afterward. She wanted to know how it felt to hear those words. General Yenbu replied on behalf of everyone. We all heard the words, but they were never recorded. That's when the swordsman remembered that everyone had reacted the same way to the celestial cave. But the blonde guardian continued to say she was ashamed for having put them in danger. She said that since she had endangered everyone when she went berserk, she now sent them an apology. It would come in the form of salvation. She had the solution to purge the root scorpions. It was by using the ability called Harmony, which involved diverse things uniting into one. She continued, saying that Harmony allowed 2 different entities to merge. As a subject of that kingdom, she had some special abilities, such as harmonizing skills. She wanted to do it by merging with the real ability of the prison director. 2 hours after the Mancha berserk attack, the destruction caused by the energy bomb had ended. The leader of the demons said that pollution should have significantly reduced fruit production. That would bring them one step closer to conquering the Divine Kingdom. This was the long-awaited moment. The Divine Kingdom had suppressed them for too long. The order of the demons was for the scorpions to reclaim what belonged to them. But as he said this, a second wave of power began to strike them. They were prepared to attack when they noticed an iron-coated barrier rising. But it wasn't just that, it was the harmonization between the prison director and General Mangcho. The Iron Wall was a royal ability that defended by attacking first. Its range was limited, but with Harmony, the ability extended just like the general's limbs. The question was, who had triggered those calculations, since the King of the North was supposed to be dead? Now they had the ability to get rid of everyone at once. They would expel them beyond the borders of the kingdom. Inside the divine tree, after a long time and much fighting, the Lord was tired. The protagonist was walking through that sea, dragging his chains, until, reaching a certain place, he found what he was looking for. The protagonist had already noticed a sound echoing in his ears. He had been hearing that sound for a while. It was rhythmic and pulsing. He thought it sounded like a heartbeat and finally found the source of the noise. He was on the upper floor inside the sacred tree, and his hands were trembling. The sensation felt like the last time, as if his body was responding. However, he had felt the same thing before when he saw the fake Jiguk. That's why he needed to verify it. That's why he introduced himself again, saying he was the eternal Lord Jae Seok Chien. Then he summoned that being to respond to the master's call. At that moment, the tree began to twist, vibrating in shades of blue. The countless souls embedded in it began to writhe. Several branches started emerging from that red sea. They all headed toward the protagonist, trying to strike him. One of the branches nearly hit his eye, but he asked if fear knew its absolute duties. In fact, the Heavenly Lord was the original owner of the sacred tree. Long ago, when that master sought subjects to support him, Jiguk was a child raised in a humble garden on the outskirts of the celestial kingdom. At the time, he noticed a talent in that child that no one else had seen yet. Of course, Jiguk declined the sudden invitation, but Jae Seok-chien, to entice her, showed her the only branch of the sacred tree from that kingdom. He believed that, as ruler of the celestial kingdom, only that person had the power to raise the tree. As soon as she saw that single branch of the sacred tree, Jiguk was tempted to accept. She revealed that it was something she had always wanted to do, and that was how the Heavenly Lord made an irresistible offer. It was all thanks to the information from Damon's Eye of Wisdom. To the Heavenly Lord, Damon was like a teacher who had taken the title of disciple, while Jiguk became a daughter who also took on that role. She called him father and contributed greatly to the unity among the four celestial kings. That was how the protagonist created the characters, but he had never stopped to think much about it. But with the real Jiguk rejecting Jae Seok-chien, everything became much more difficult. While he was watching, the mission arrived. He was to destroy the kingdom of Jiguk. He who should show mercy as ruler of the heavens was to destroy Jiguk's kingdom. He could only imagine that for the Lord to want to destroy the tree, there had to be a significant conflict. The protagonist remembered that part while developing the game, but now all he could do was ask to command her one more time. He told his disciple to tell him everything. Even though the tree was in chaos, he insisted. He wanted to know what was wrong to see if it could be fixed. While the protagonist was having that conversation, the battle continued, and many losses were being counted on both sides. It seemed that the people of the tree had managed to achieve victory. General Mangcho could hardly believe they had succeeded. She was satisfied because everyone had managed to protect the kingdom of Jiguk. It was good to see the general's plan working, but that wasn't the end of the work. The battle had caused significant damage. Chorong shouted that they still had some potions and should distribute them to the people. After all that chaos, the group headed to the palace, and Chorong was thankful to General Yunbu. But the feeling was mutual. Even so, the general asked that the two of them remain within her line of sight. Chorong said she was also a subject of a celestial king and knew proper manners. But first, Mangcho wanted to know why the vanguard had come to visit their kingdom. Looking at the general, she said their mission was to save the divine kingdom with the ruler of the heavens. But General Yunbu clarified. The question was why they hadn't revealed themselves from the beginning, so that their intention to help would be clear. Mangcho explained that the distrust came from being in a time of war. Hyuk-soo grew irritated upon seeing that both generals were doubting them after they had helped. Chorong said he should listen to their side, and besides, the demons had only retreated temporarily, and what would delay them was that they no longer had supplies to fight when Zhong Jang arrived. And when Chorong mentioned finding their master, a tremor began to shake everything again. No one knew for sure why those tremors were becoming more and more frequent. However, the Heavenly Lord's allies saw him, and the sight made their eyes go wide. The protagonist was emerging from inside the tree. He appeared after forcing his way out, hands covered in the tree's sap. His allies and the guardians looked at that lord with frightened eyes. Despite being the celestial lord, he was acting strangely. The general concluded that he was an undead soldier and they should stay alert. To the swordsman, the term undead was strange, but he should think of him as a ghost. He was a ghost born from spirits that devoured one another. But if he truly were a ghost, they should eliminate him immediately. Compared to before, the swordsman was getting the hang of it, and Chorong was noticing the difference in him. Even so, it was frightening how such a dangerous ghost looked so much like the celestial lord. The general knew that he wasn't an opponent they could fight. However, General Yunbu had a completely different view. She believed there was no problem in letting him go, but she had seen what others hadn't. The celestial lord was coming out of the tree moments after the undead soldier had emerged. Raising his hand toward the undead, he ordered him to surrender. He should obey the celestial lord's command. After hearing that order, the undead had no other reaction but to kneel, and everyone could see that the protagonist had everything under control. Now General Yunbu asked who he was, someone who had granted passage. The protagonist made it clear that he was the ruler of the heavens, the conqueror of the celestial cave. He made it clear he was there only to cut down the tree. Mangcho couldn't believe what she was hearing and wanted to know what had happened to that lord. She said that if he cut down the sacred tree, he would destroy the kingdom of Jiguk. She declared herself the absolute servant of the celestial king of that kingdom. Even if he was the celestial lord, if he intended to damage the tree, she would treat him as an enemy. The tree also had a level system, and its level was that of divine generals. But Jiguk and the celestial lord surpassed the tree's power level, and that meant they possessed power beyond what the tree could withstand. When she tried to swallow both of them, she exceeded her own limits. Now the tree would naturally expose everything that was trapped within its system. She explained that he was the one who had been trapped in the system, while the living soldier was merely a soldier the tree had managed to create. In that case, he was the fake one, and what the tree had made was the real one. The same had happened with Jiguk. She said the tree had managed to digest half of her and create a living soldier, but it hadn't been able to swallow her soul, which is why it tried to expel her. But for some reason, and because she had only half her memories, Jiguk refused to leave. And the result of that was the sacred tree splitting her soul in two as well. The other half of her had left long ago, and was among them as a living soldier. Even so, she insisted on not leaving and even asked the Celestial Lord to remain in the tree. After fighting the other souls inside the sacred tree, Jiguk was split into three. One part remained in the tree, another had become an undead. The third returned to the kingdom pretending to be the original queen. It was all too strange for Mangcho. However, the protagonist stated that the tree needed to be removed. It had already reached its limit. After saying that, more tremors were felt throughout the branches during the conversation. Many of the people on the branches weren't bothered by the tremors, but they kept getting worse, to the point of endangering some lives. Soon it would collapse, and if that happened while many civilians were still there, it would be fatal. Inevitably, the branches were falling all at once, and that moment wasn't a time for hesitation, but to move forward. With that, the Lord activated his omnipotence, creating the Hydra net. With it, he would be able to hold the tree long enough for civilians to escape. But the tree would only remain intact while the Emperor's chains could hold it. General Yenbu asked if he had any plan for all the civilians. He said he had planned everything. There was a safe place. And no matter what kind of attack they faced, he asked Mancho for help. She was to take everyone to the Celestial Cave. But to the general, that was terrible news. She would have to enter the cave, the same cave where Flower Blossom had died in her place. She didn't feel comfortable with the story of the cave and thought he was joking with her. Serious and without hesitation, he said it wasn't a joke, that she couldn't understand, since she had never entered the cave, and in there, it was a dimension separate from the Celestial Kingdom. Because it also meant that no matter what happened outside, the general feared that everyone would enter to take refuge and then be unable to get out. But the Celestial Lord made it clear that, once conquered, the cave was harmless, so she could stop being so afraid. As soon as he said that, more branches began to break. He knew that the reason the kingdom needed a conqueror was to heal the sacred tree, and it became clear why Jiguk didn't leave the tree to save everyone in the kingdom. She wanted to save everyone from the war and the demon guild. Everyone could be saved from that rotten tree thanks to their queen. The protagonist, showing his own copy, said that he would conquer the Celestial Cave, that they didn't need to worry, they just had to enter the cave. Tarong was concerned about everything that was happening. When the swordsman wanted to join the two, the protagonist warned it was better to conquer the cave. He reminded the swordsman that he had already gone through the cave and knew it was impossible to conquer it alone. Hyuksu didn't seem pleased to follow his lord's copy, but he would obey. Soon, the remains of the tree began to fall. The ceiling at the cave entrance was about to collapse. The roots that supported the cave had rotted, but Mangcho appeared to hold it up, growing into her larger state while the citizens fled. She asked the conqueror to do his part. It no longer mattered what had happened to the queen. She wanted to defend the kingdom with her. The protagonist promised he would help, and that was exactly what he came to do. More and more, the kingdom began to collapse, and so the team moved with greater urgency. Chorong and Hyuksu took responsibility for the citizens, while the other protagonists created by the sacred tree entered the Celestial Cave. And amid all this, General Yenbu handed something to the protagonist. She said she had kept it with her all that time and didn't know what it was. She thought it might be related to the memory loss he had mentioned before. Inside was a jade plaque and a data set. She believed those belongings had perhaps been waiting a long time inside that box, for that day that had finally come. Those words gave the protagonist a harsh reality check, and all he could do was close his eyes silently, while the destruction of the tree continued. There was destruction everywhere, and it was as if everything were falling apart. Everything might lead to a return to nothing. Even though he remembered Jiguk asking for peace, he couldn't fulfill that wish. That at the moment was not his role, no matter how sorry he felt. He would need to destroy everything, because that was neither of their roles anymore. He remembered the conversation he had with a member of the team, when they talked about efforts to fix things that only made them worse. In that case, the hostility action would be triggered automatically. Sometimes the best solution was to destroy everything and start over. Now he was following his own advice. He was destroying everything. There would be nothing left of the tree. Everything was being undone to return to the beginning, to when there was only a single branch of the sacred tree. To fix everything, he would recover what was lost. He wanted to retrieve Jiguk's lost soul, and with that, 1 week after the collapse of the underwater palace, the kingdom of Jiguk was being destroyed. And now, after many were encouraged to give an answer, one of them spoke and reported that the kingdom of Jiguk had fallen and a ruler had returned. Those were the pieces of information that Manhua, the leader of the demon guild, was extracting. The man who had said everything he knew about the kingdom was begging for his life, and even after paying for it, he was rewarded with a precise arrow. Even though he didn't run or try to escape, still tied up with his face against the wall, he, like many others, was meeting the same end. Everyone who reached the execution wall in the kingdom of Zhongjang had no other way out, and that demonic leader only cared about enjoying his pipe. And even if he gave a reason for doing all this, in truth he did it simply for fun. Zhongjang was a mountainous kingdom built around a massive volcano. Just as the kingdom of Jiguk tended to the sacred tree, the kingdom of Zhongjang took advantage of the volcano and made its kingdom grow. Any violent criminal or demon was sentenced to the underwater palace. They were taken to Zhongjiang and thrown into the volcano. Their remains were used in weapon forging. Weapons infused with the souls of criminals carried superior power, and the warriors who wielded them were destined to eliminate demons. And when the war ended with the demons' victory, and the 4 celestial kingdoms were divided, Zhongjiang declared its nation part of the demon kingdom. The demons wanted to conquer the entire celestial territory under the rule of the Demon Guild. That kingdom was using warriors to create magical inventions used to dominate citizens, and the blacksmiths had to forge more and more weapons. And the final word always came from the leader of the Demon Guild. He said it was all in the name of karma, even the law of return. At that moment, just as the executioner was about to take a break, he had to come back. One of the soldiers sent to the kingdom of Jiguk had returned alive. Now he would go through a firm interrogation. They believed there were only 2 scenarios for someone to return alive from a mission. Either he had completed the mission or simply failed it. The executioner decided he fit the second category and should be punished. Everything would happen in the foundry area located at the back of Zhongjiang's kingdom. The leader of that sector was a demon known for being very lazy, and unless it was an extraordinary occasion, all the guards would be dozing off. But unfortunately for that soldier, he arrived right in the middle of a preparation. There was no escape. He would be prepared along with the others. But he wanted to deliver the message. He didn't mind begging for his life. Even with the gag, he managed to mutter that the Celestial Lord had returned. But he was ignored for not being the first to say such nonsense. Of course, that soldier also had the same reaction when he heard the truth from the protagonist. But now that soldier had no more time to speak. He had entered the middle of a preparation. Now he would have to use his trump card to escape. But for that soldier, everything was proving difficult. He had to watch the next one in line be prepared right in front of him. Not even a general went unnoticed. The king of that empire was bothered to see him standing before him. The ruler of Zhongjiang's kingdom didn't want to see any of those soldiers in his presence. The order was for preparations to continue. For that soldier, it was hard to see his friend punished right in front of him. Meanwhile, the red-haired general just looked back, seemingly amused. Her sovereign called her, for he had a mission for her. He wanted Bunryan to find the conqueror of the celestial cave. That made the punishment lose its interest for her. Now she was only paying attention to the words of her sovereign. The sovereign asked his general, "Didn't you want to know why he ordered the punishment of the soldiers?" His general knew that her sovereign had his own reasons. But for that soldier who saw his best friend punished before his eyes, things were different. He had to help carry his friend without thinking much about those things. All that remained was a sphere. It was his friend's treasure, a very special iron marble. His friend had intended to use that sphere when captured as a prisoner of war. It was an escape route for those who didn't want to be tortured until the end. All he had to do was infuse that marble with his divine power, and his body would burst into flames. Just enough time for the rope to burn and let him escape, though his body could suffer as well. But just being able to buy some time seemed worth it. He was in the fire palace atop a hill and thought he could run. He was going to deliver the news that the ruler had returned, but at that moment, an arrow was aimed at his head. That's when the volcano started becoming unstable. That demon lost control, unable to even handle the arrow. Meanwhile, the soldier heard that apparently the sacred tree had fallen, and even the demon believed that might really be happening. Now the soldiers were remembering the promise made by the protagonist. Even if he might not escape punishment, he was moved by the news. After everything was over, the protagonist headed to the next kingdom. He was using a fragment of the tree to fly toward the volcano. After seeing that piece of tree heading their way, the demon began to panic. He thought it might fall right on top of them and ordered immediate action. Right away, they began raising the defensive wall. In just moments, the artificial ability was activated, and an iron wall was raised. The impact of the tree fragment was imminent. As soon as it collided with the wall, it shattered it into pieces. A small explosion made the masked demons shield their eyes. One of the demons spoke with satisfaction that the iron wall had worked, but the guild leader wanted all the troops gathered, and at the Lord's command, all demonic soldiers were assembled. The Celestial Lord announced that it was already too late, and now the demon leader looked at his servant with hatred. A voice exclaimed that the Zhongjiang soldier they intended to punish had disappeared. That person had been approached by the protagonist, who asked him to stay silent. Since the Celestial Lord was wearing the demonic mask, it took the soldier a moment to recognize him, and as soon as he removed the mask, he told the young man that their work was not yet finished. Acting with intelligence and cunning, he handed that soldier a demon soldier uniform. Now the two were disguised to infiltrate. The Lord was about to leave and told the soldier not to panic, as he would return shortly. The demon leader was not pleased. It was the first time a prisoner had escaped from him. So the leader said he wouldn't bother searching for the fugitive. He was tired and going to take a nap. With that, he handpicked one of his subordinates and asked him to bring 30 blacksmiths, and to punish them in place of the one who escaped. He wanted to see who was foolish enough to throw a tree. That soldier he handpicked and was walking beside was someone different. The demon leader could sense it the moment the person allowed it. He even called him by name, saying it had been a long time since he had served him. The demon leader recognized by the voice that it was Chorong. She warned through the Lord's body that the man should not say her name out loud. Chorong was temporarily controlling his mind with the Lord's permission in order to communicate. She wanted to speak with the demon leader before the Lord left for the kingdom. A pact had been made. Thus he allowed Chorong to communicate mentally with him. The terms of the pact were bound only to the original terms of the King of the North. Now she could also share and deliver memories and information just as she did with her master. That's how, while he was flying toward that kingdom, he managed to gather all the information he needed. To put it simply, the undead soldiers were summoned by the divine powers of the sacred tree. So when the sacred tree collapsed, the divine powers would vanish. Since the protagonist himself had just cut down the tree, a countdown would now begin. It would end in 10 days. After that period, the celestial power created by the undead version of the tree would disappear. The soul of Jiguk, which the tree had absorbed, would also dissipate. For the protagonist, that time frame was interesting. It wasn't impossible to complete everything in 10 days. Quickly, the status message appeared, congratulating him for destroying the tree. He had now fulfilled 40% of the Celestial Lord's wish. He was content imagining that there would be a special reward waiting at the end of that mission. He was pleased because he had made more progress than expected, and as a reward, he gained 3 skill points. And a special mission was unlocked. He had to insert the principal. The status explained that the wish was a mission assigned by the Lord, but the principal was his own mission. Now he was facing the screen, trying to choose the next mission. The progress rate would increase, and the realization of wishes could grow. On top of that, he would meet a special soul that was eager to see him. That last part left the protagonist uneasy. Since the rewards were so good, there was no reason to refuse the offer. His wish was to revive the kingdom of Jiguk. He knew that the 4 celestial kings fought and split because of Jae Seok Chien. Thus, a new mission would be to gather the destroyed fragments of Jiguk's soul in order to revive the kingdom. Being close to the demon leader, he said he already had all the information about the underwater palace. That man was scum. He had escaped from prison and joined the demon guild. All the undead soldiers were programmed to go to the kingdom of Zhongjiang. The Lord's proposal was to free that demon leader from his own curse. Every soul that entered the underwater palace was a prisoner. There were no exceptions. Even the prison wardens had once been prisoners. That included Chorong herself and the demon leader Oeon, and now she was trying to recruit him to their side. That surprise attack made all the demon soldiers search every corner for the one responsible. One of the soldiers approached the leader, reporting that they believed someone had infiltrated. He ordered the search to be stopped, claiming there was no infiltrator. His orders were to be followed immediately. He said that if they had been attacked by a tree, they should just report what had happened. Then he continued walking without concern, together with the protagonist who walked beside him. Now they were heading toward a more distant area. The Lord only had a view of the demon leader's back, but not for a second did he lower his guard, and noticed when the executioner tried to attack. Yoeon thought he could land a surprise blow, but he was the one surprised. Only after feeling the weight of the protagonist's hand did he realize it wasn't Chorong. As he had thought at first, the protagonist didn't care if he made noise. He warned him that someone of a lower rank could be punished by someone of a higher one. And to the Celestial Lord, it didn't matter if he would have to admit to everyone that he couldn't handle him. And he took advantage of the fact that luck was on his side. The commander of the Demon Guild was an old colleague of Chorong, and on his left arm, he bore the mark of the Forbidden Curse. And as soon as he mentioned that mark, the demon leader indeed fell into a terrible state. However, the offer was tempting. The Lord would lift the curse mark if he gained his cooperation. The man was terrified when the curse was mentioned in front of him. He calmed down when he realized that he was standing before the ruler of the heavens. His eyes widened when he realized he was facing the Celestial Lord. He remained silent as he listened to Ioyan say he was nothing but an imposter. But the protagonist, while flying above the tree, heard their story in detail. And she said she was a citizen of Kwangmak who once called the northern seas her home. Those seas that were also known as the Dead Sea. King Daemon converted all of them into citizens through divine abilities. From the many prisoners of the divine kingdom, Lord Daemon would select a small number of talents. Pointing his finger at the chosen ones, he would forgive and grant them the chance to serve him. If they accepted the offer, they would undergo transformations to adapt to the environment. This applied to all prison directors, including Chorong and Oeon. However, she wasn't sure about Hyuk-soo. He was a director who joined after that season. She didn't know the others' crimes, but hers was refusing to participate in the recruitment, and it was precisely during a period of war. Their kingdom was surrounded in flames, betrayed and taken by surprise. The protagonist was curious whether it was Quanmok himself who raised her. She said no. At that time, the king was busy guarding the front lines. She said the king had no interest in administration and left it in the hands of the citizens. She said that back then, she couldn't join the troops because she had a younger brother to care for. Even while fleeing, she was caught and considered a traitor for abandoning the state during an emergency. She said that was when she met Yoyan. He acknowledged he was from the kingdom of Zhongjang, while she was from the kingdom of Quanmok. The two were sharing the same cell at the time, having been accused of the same crime. At that time, there was a law decreed by the king of the north, expiration points based on the severity of the crime, and to reduce even a single point, the trials were extreme. And at the end of the day, the two prisoners had no choice in how they would be punished. Huayan tried to make conversation with her, but she was too tired to talk. Just as points could be reduced, they could also increase if problems were caused. After a decade, they were still in the same cell, sharing in the punishments. She could see his body taking shape little by little. At first, she didn't talk to him because she thought he was a complicated person. She thought she might become like him and cause trouble at any moment. She knew that pain had a way of wounding the soul in its own unique manner. It could also expose the fragility within each person. And even after decades, he still kept trying to talk to her. She saw his arm covered with the mark of the vengeance curse, a curse where a vengeful spirit would merge with the body of the cursed one. The curse was feared because the host could lose control over themselves. Eventually, the mark would begin to grow, feeding off the host's body. It would continue to grow, taking parts of the body until the host could no longer provide nutrients. At the time, she was interested in curses, so she recognized the mark immediately. And that was the first thing she spoke to him about, the curse, which in his case was something rare. She wanted to look at it up close, as she was curious to learn more. Only later did she realize that she was already talking to him. After decades, she couldn't hold back. Ioyan kept asking if she knew about it, and if she was a sorceress. They were always being watched in the next cell over by someone who got into a lot of trouble. Sharon replied that she had recently read a book about it, but didn't know much. Then she asked him to take his hands off her shoulder. As always, she looked at him cautiously, expecting any offensive move. He felt bad for wanting to talk to someone who always ignored him. Meanwhile, she was only thinking about what he was saying. Angrily, he threatened that if she told anyone about the mark, he would come after her. And when she decided to take the test for the position of prison director, he was also interested. He had also gone with her and was there when she fulfilled her duties. He was demoted for secretly entering the sacred library of the king. As punishment, he lost his position and title in just 2 days for reading forbidden texts. Hyuk-soo, who at the time was just a guard, had the courage to expose Oeon. That's why he was sent back to the cell. 4 years ago, he disappeared from the northern seas during a rebellion. She hadn't known where he had fled to. Only now did she find out that he had allied with the demons. The protagonist warned that young man that the demon guild could study artificial abilities. And when he heard that he should have trusted Daemon, he got even more upset. He said the king wasn't someone who helped others. He became who he was because he had been neglected. As he said that, he prepared another strike, thinking it might succeed. He was determined to show what happened when someone laid a hand on an officer of the Demon Guild. With enraged eyes, he was ready to try punishing whoever dared to ridicule him, and the protagonist merely observed that person's mental breakdown. However, little by little, the arrow he was forming with his power began to weaken, and more, he realized he wouldn't be able to stand up to that person. Meanwhile, the protagonist's allies simply watched what was happening. Yoyan looked at his hands and couldn't understand why his ability had disappeared. He knew he had performed the summoning correctly, but the protagonist explained why. He was the sovereign and could not be touched by someone of lower rank, and since Daemon answered to him, Yoyan couldn't attack him because he was above even his own master. It seemed he understood he couldn't attack because of the hierarchy rules. He thought he could get away with it because of Daemon's absence. However, the soldier allied with the protagonist revealed that he was the celestial lord himself. He was there to restore the honor of Zhongjang. He also said the essence of the oath was eternity. Therefore, fleeing would not sever the bond between master and subject. He asked his allied soldier Manhua to observe and keep watch. He told Yuan not to be so disappointed. He had only been honest. He was aware that his name had been forgotten with time. Even if he didn't believe it, he had absolute power to undo all curses. He said he could also end his oath to Daemon if he cooperated. Interested in a deal, Yuan was willing to obey that person's orders. The protagonist said he was concerned about someone. He pulled something from his pocket that was important to him. He handed over the heart chained by his own chains and asked to be shown the way. He wanted to be taken to where the undead soldier Jiguk was, and when the two passed near other soldiers, the commander was saluted. There was no time to lose, and he simply asked them to return to doing good work. They were now in the kingdom of Zhongjang. It was the entrance of the Fire King. As they walked, ahead of them were some demonic beings amusing themselves with the citizens. Although he appeared indifferent, he clenched his fist in disapproval. They were heading toward the path of the Southern Fire Temple. He said he would guide him to that place, adding that his jurisdiction wasn't vast. He made it clear that if anything happened, he wouldn't be able to enter. The protagonist said that was fine. He just wanted to know what he would face from that point on. The collaborator warned that, in fact, there was a lot. The kingdom of Zhongjiang was home to the 4 temples, one for each direction, covering north, south, east, and west, and in the center stood the Great Fire Peak, a volcano with magma. Thanks to the volcano, they were able to develop countless magical weapons, but they were also at the volcano's mercy, and that's why the king established the temples. And every year, priests from all 4 temples gathered to pray and keep the volcano at peace. The protagonist wanted to know if that was some kind of oath. In the War of the Heavens, the prayers served as binding oaths. Through prayer, Zhongjiang swore to offer divine power in exchange for halting eruptions. But all of that was old news now. Zhongjiang had changed since the demons were allowed in, and the first thing the Demon Guild did was take control of Zhongjiang. They abandoned the temples and merged them into one. However, the collaborator wanted to know what soul was chained. That was Jiguk. He remembered that before leading the sacred tree, he had used his authority as lord to bind her with the chains of good and evil. Yoyan was a vengeful spirit, but that chain also seemed terrifying. The protagonist offered to tell the story about that heart, but the young man refused. The young man didn't care about breaking his own curse. When the protagonist heard that if he couldn't break the curse, Yoyan was willing to curse him instead. He warned that before that happened, he would take care of that person's soul. To him, a vengeful spirit was no big deal. The sacred tree itself was full of curses. What he was looking for was just a fragment of her soul sealed inside one of the kings of Jiguk. He believed it was possible that an inevitable fight awaited him. He remembered that at the time, he wanted the game's development to happen quickly. He stopped thinking that way once he entered the game, especially after realizing he was still alive. It wasn't what he wanted, so he would just remain seated. Because of everything that happened to him at the beginning of the game, he knew well what it was like to want to give up. That's why he couldn't just leave her alone. Meanwhile, Manhua watched the sovereign depart and wished him all the best. And somewhere else, a card game was beginning. He thought that through the game he might extract some information. Because there was a certain punishment for losing that game, they could also be accused of cheating at any time. And a fight between soldiers could break out at the slightest slip. A special ability could be triggered. In that case, the protective hand was activated, and when a cheating accusation was made, they had to present at least some evidence, and without it, they had to accept defeat. And after winning, he turned his opponent into a card in his deck. And clearly, the commander of another area wasn't supposed to be in the south. That bothered the local leader, who didn't want to share his space. Hostile, he asked what business he had in that region. Seeing more, he even took one of his subordinates with him. However, that commander said it was nothing much. Something had happened during a punishment. That's why he needed to inspect the interior of the temple. He just wanted to finish the task quickly and leave. After all the other temples were closed, only the one in the south remained standing. But it was far from a temple. It had become a lawless game park for those who honored the shadows. The area the protagonist needed access to was a sealed and well-guarded location, and the only commander with access was named Cheon. He was the commander of the Demon Guild, and most of the time, he wasn't welcoming to outsiders, only for some games, and when they won, the punishment for the other person was severe, and they had to build willpower using logic itself. It was recognized that strength was always close to muscle, but it also came with posture. They also had to live by that conviction and defeat whoever stood in their way. That was how the Demon Guild believed and lived by the law of the strongest. Knowing how to develop weapons was also a form of strength. These were a group of outcasts from the Demon Kingdom due to their lack of skill and divine power. Even so, they wanted to prove they had the right to speak about strength, which is why they became obsessed with weapons. Of course, there were no rules on the game field. However, that upper commander warned that he wouldn't waste his time playing cards. If that demon made it clear, he wouldn't be polite unless his wish was granted. But Yoyan didn't seem willing to be polite with a bunch of gamblers. All the gamblers were outraged. They thought it was typical of a traveler not to get involved in anything. Yoyan, seeing that the protagonist made a move, said he didn't need to worry about trash. However, he was about to start the show. He said he couldn't insult his commander. He asked what would happen if they labeled them as traitors and dragged them out of there. With that, he got what he wanted. He was invited to play in place of the commander. And before Yoyan could even see it, the protagonist was already seated at the gaming table, and his demeanor was pure confidence. But of course, it irritated the commander since he should have been informed first. Now he had no idea what they were thinking. However, he started laying down some rules. If he won, they would have to hand over the priest passes to the executioner. If he lost, all the executioners, including his commander, would give their lives. He knew that for demons, Everything boiled down to betting positions and lies. The game had several rules that demons found interesting, which greatly pleased Chang. Everyone was waiting for the special bet to begin. The protagonist knew that it didn't matter who he was, he just had to blend in among them. The card game was made up of soldiers and generals. In the game, where soldiers and generals were shuffled and 5 cards from each drawn. After that, they were supposed to exchange a card with the opponent, and once the cards were revealed, whoever had managed to pass on their general victories would be the winner. It was basically a fast version of a game called Old Maids, but mainly it was a game based entirely on luck. Chang thought that, to be fairer, they should call in a third person to shuffle the cards, and after all the bets were placed on the table, they could pick 5 of any. He thought he should draw enough general cards to at least secure a tie. That's why he believed he would pick 5 generals, and each card taken from the table was a reason for attention. It seemed like the protagonist had gotten the hang of playing that interesting game. He smiled because he wanted to flip the card in style. That was a naive kind of thinking. Demons didn't play like that. So he slammed the card on the table and caused a scene. Several of them flew into the air, revealing that practically all of them were bad cards. They realized that all the cards on the table were terrible, and the cheating had already begun. Yoyan was startled by the way the protagonist played his role, so the demon thought it was just a trick of sleight of hand, muscle strength, and flexibility. More importantly, he thought they had managed to fool each other. The person had to make a scene, and that would distinguish soldiers from generals. Everyone thought that clueless rookie player was ridiculous. They couldn't understand the trick even after watching it. His ally was furious. He didn't know if he was doing it on purpose or just fully immersed in the role of a fool. However, the protagonist made it clear that everyone had their own plans, and no one could figure out what was going through that lord's mind. The protagonist kept playing, and now the opponent was the one picking the cards. And once everyone had chosen, it was time for the reveal. To confirm if it was time to flip, he asked. The one shuffling the cards believed all of them had been created using his own ability. He could change the image with just a touch, so it didn't matter what card was chosen, the opponent would always lose. A game where you already knew the outcome was always a better game. However, the protagonist had his own way of having fun playing that game. Since he had made it clear that everyone had a plan, it was time to reveal his. He had played the soldier card, which suddenly transformed. After confirming that he had won, he raised his arms and started screaming like a madman. He thought he should crush them with overwhelming power. Of course, the loser didn't like everyone having fun, and after he tried to change the rules, everyone turned against him. He was accused of not being able to follow his own rules and of being a traitor. The protagonist was causing a mess, but made it clear that what he wanted were the travel passes. And in the middle of so many people shouting, the 2 of them were paralyzed by someone. It was a young woman with a very familiar face.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.